The Cowboy's Catch, a fun, faith-based cowboy romance. Written by Kimberly Krey. Narrated by Morgana Morningside. Chapter 1. Jason Keller kept his eyes and ears trained on the stage, sparks of nervous energy flaring within him. The Bransons' annual charity auction was in full swing, and any minute now, Marlee Jenkins would take the stage. Last year, the intriguing brunette would introduce the family she'd be raising funds for on behalf of her father's trout farm. But this year, Jason planned to shake things up. His adrenaline spiked each time the microphone moved from one announcer to the next. The old, restored barn was decked out with spring daisies, fresh greens, and all the usual antiques, but the auction itself was far from formal. No program to speak of, no real order in the bidding process. Bidders simply hollered over one another while Dee Branson kept track of the winners in her trusty notepad. If all went according to plan, sweet Mrs. Branson would be jotting Jason's name into that notepad right beside an item, or should he say event, that wasn't even up for bid. Yet. A grin pulled at his lips. He tipped his head to see Marley through the crowd. Just a glimpse of her gorgeous profile sent those nerves into action once more.
"Dude,"
Taylor said with an elbow nudge,
"I don't think you understand just how out of the question this scheme of yours is. Ever seen a do not touch sign?"
Jason shot Taylor a disapproving scowl.
"Of course."
Taylor chuckled under his breath.
"Well, Marlee Jenkins is a walking do not touch sign if I ever saw one. There's no way she's going to agree to this."
This being the date night Jason planned to propose. Taylor might have more experience with the auction, seeing that his parents ran the show, but Jason had learned that going after what he wanted often paid off, even if he had to get creative in the process.
"I don't know why you think it's such a stretch," Jason said. "She auctioned off dates with her younger sisters last year. I'm sure she plans to do the same thing this year, too."
Of course, she had specific qualifications for the bidder. Must be a city resident, must pass a background check, and must have each gal, though both were legal adults, home by 11 p.m. and not a minute later.
"Yeah, but notice how she only auctioned herself off for a month's worth of filleting as many trout as the winner could catch, not a date." "Yeah, well, tonight, that's gonna change."
It might sound cocky or even crass, but Jason had only the best intentions. Treat Marley to a fine evening with a perfect country gentleman like himself, and give her a night away from demands far too great for someone her age. Jason knew firsthand what it was like to have the world on his shoulders. By the grace of God, he'd escaped it. Perhaps he could help Marlee Jenkins now, a woman who'd caught his attention since he'd seen her in action at Charlie's trout farm. He never imagined that a group of delicate-looking women, some barely out of their teens, would be running a trout farm where they gut and fillet the latest catch for every fisher in town.
"Gonna win a date with one of those Jenkins girls?" came a voice from behind. "Good luck outbidding me," came another. "I put in overtime on the field for this."
Jason glanced over his shoulder to see a couple of Bob Branson's ranch hands, Brody and Lincoln. They were good kids, as far as he could tell.
"Who do you boys have your eyes on?" Jason asked.
"Lily," they said in unison. Jason lifted a brow.
"Is that the youngest one?"
Brody nodded.
"Brit's cute too, but she's 22, and girls usually don't want guys that are younger than them."
Good point. Jason had been pleased to find out Marley was 24, like him. In fact, he had 4 months on her, which made him a bit older. Bob Branson, the kind man who gave Jason his first shot at ranch life, took the mic from the Weatherly twins. The elderly woman auctioned off pies of the month to be delivered throughout the year. Strawberry rhubarb for April, blueberry for May. Jason had been tempted to bid on the pies himself, but he didn't want to make a spectacle before he bid on what he really wanted. Besides, Dee Branson had been a second mother to him since he'd come to work on their ranch over 4 years ago, and Dee would take it as a downright insult if he paid for another woman's desserts. With squinted eyes,
Bob stared into the section where Marley sat with her sisters. Jason's pulse revved like a hot engine ready to rip. "How about we get the owner and operator of Charlie's Trout Farm up here for our next auction?" the burly man thundered. The audience cheered. Brody and Lincoln shot to their feet and whistled high-pitched catcalls as Marley took the stage, Lily and Britt in tow. Her younger sisters had heart-shaped faces with round noses and cheeks, while Marley's oval-shaped face held high cheekbones and a narrow nose bridge. The angular features continued along her jawline, her hands, and even the well-defined slope of her delicate shoulders. No doubt all three women were beautiful, but of all the women who'd caught Jason's eye over the years, none had done it quite as effectively, not to mention inadvertently, as Marley Jenkins. Of course, he couldn't dismiss the other reasons for that, ones that had nothing to do with her outward appearance. The woman's generosity was evident in events like these, but at the Trout Farm, she demonstrated genuine care for nearly every customer who came and went. Nearly because her kindness had yet to extend to Jason. It was often he overheard Marley encouraging someone during a rough time, or laughing heartily at a joke even if it was more of a cringer. She had a way of putting the townsfolk at ease in her company, and he admired that. Marley curled her fingers around the mic. "Thanks, Bob. How we doing tonight, everyone?" The woman's small-scale drawl drew Jason in every time he heard it. She paused for the crowd to cheer once more, a gorgeous smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. Unlike her other fairly narrow features, Marley's lips were full, and her smile was wide. "The family we're raising funds for this year couldn't be here, but most of you know the Inglesons. Danny lost his job due to a back injury, leaving his wife Kathy, who's been caring for their 3 small children with a heavy load to bear in medical expenses and such. Let's see how much we can raise to help him out. What do you say?" Jason nodded and clapped, feeling like he was in store for a medical emergency of his own. His heart was thundering like a stampede of wild horses. "You're gonna chicken out," Taylor said with another nudge to his arm. "Keep telling yourself that if it makes you feel better. But get ready to be surprised because this is going to be my lucky day. I can feel it. Face it, dude. The woman doesn't want any man. And as hard as it might be to understand for a guy who's had women throwing themselves at his feet since he was 16, Marley Jenkins seems to especially not want you." Jason chuckled. He couldn't help it. The statement was true enough on both counts. Due to his high-profile family and the Los Angeles life he lived before moving to Montana, Jason was no stranger to women wanting him if not for status alone, even here in the small town of Phillipsburg. And then there was Marley. Jason had often approached the counter at the Trout Farm with his latest catch only to find that the oldest sister had made herself scarce yet again. At first it just seemed like a coincidence, but as the pattern continued, Britt or Lily filleting the half-dozen trout he'd caught while Jason did his best to pretend he wasn't wondering where Marley had run off to, he'd realized the truth of it for himself. She was especially not interested in him, which didn't make a whole lot of sense. She didn't even know him, something he hoped to remedy very soon. 310, came a loud bid from behind Lincoln. Jason shot a glance over his shoulder to see the anxious cowboys were already bidding. Whoa. He'd been too zoned out to notice the bidding for a date with Lily had already begun. The townsfolk cheered. "That's a new record for one of our date nights," Marley said with a grin. Lily shifted her weight from one high heel to the next, a smile pasted on her blushing face. "Do I hear 320? Marley asked. 320 right here, Brody said. "We're breaking records here today," Marley cheered. "The Ingleson family will be very happy to hear it. We've got 320 for a date night with the beautiful Lily. Do I hear 350? Lincoln said at a booming voice. "Plus I'll do a day's worth of farm work for the family, whatever they'd like." Brody gave his friend a shoulder nudge. "I thought you couldn't go above 320. Lincoln gave him a sly grin. "I pulled some strings." Marley looked stunned. Lily had a wide smile on her face, her gaze fixed on Lincoln. That's incredible, Marley breathed. Anyone want to try to outbid that offer? Going once, going twice. When no one spoke up, Marley pointed at Bob, who slammed down the mallet. Sold to Mr. Lincoln Hart for $350 and a day's worth of labor. Britt was up next. Jason could hardly stay focused through the bidding process. All he knew is that Brody bid on the evening with the middle sister as well, giving up only when someone outbid him. Another $350 bid, minus the day's labor. Now, Marley said, as I've done the last 3 years here at this fundraising event, I'll be offering 1 full month's worth of trout filleting, as much as you can catch. And we got a beautiful selection out there this year, guys. Brown trout, golden trout, cutthroats, you name it. We've even got a few of those hard-to-catch bull trout left for those who really want to test out their skills. Jason waited as the bids came and clapped along with everyone else as the winning amount came in at $260. Well, Marley said, bringing the mic back up to her lips. The gals at Charlie's Trout Farm, thank you for your continued support. Not only in fundraisers for locals like the Inglesons, but also for the generous donations we've seen appear in the collection jar for Charlie's Find a Cure Foundation as well. Your donations have amounted to a whopping $4,000 this year. Our Father's definitely smiling from the clouds. We're so thankful to be part of this incredible community. Jason's insides became a shaken can of soda, adrenaline bubbling beneath the surface and ready to blow. If he didn't speak up now, he might never get his chance. His eyes widened as Bob moved toward the center of the stage. Marley extended the microphone to him. Hurry, Jason, do it. Bob, he blurted, standing to his feet. I'd like to bid on a date night with the lovely Marlee Jenkins. Bob's eyes grew larger than dollar coins. You would? The man's usually booming voice came out like a mouse squeak. Marley hadn't relinquished the mic just yet. She took advantage of that fact and pulled it right back to her lips. That's not up for bid. She fixed a challenging glare at Jason, leaned on one hip, and folded her arms. Something seemed to speak to him in the gesture, an acknowledgement of who Jason was, the guy she always dodged at the trout farm. $500 to Charlie's charity, he blurted. Marley's pretty lips parted as her jaw dropped open. Whistles broke out over the crowd. That is a pretty penny. Bob's thunderous voice was back in full supply. Marley mumbled something under her breath and handed off the mic. She thanks you, fine sir, but says she'll have to decline. Give up, Jason. Just let it go. But he couldn't. 1,000, he blurted. $1,000 to the Ingleson family and another 1,000 to Charlie's charity. Whispers turned into outright gasps and hushed terms of amazement. I'd pay that much to go out with him, one gal blurted, causing the crowd to chuckle. That's $2,000, another piped. She's not going to be able to turn that down. That was precisely the idea. Bob cleared his throat, wiped a grin off his face, and turned to Marley, who looked like she was summoning the ability to shoot fire darts from her eyes. If it's any help to you, doll, Bob Branson said, I can vouch for the man myself. Jason Keller's a trustworthy, hard-working gentleman. Oh, just go out with the poor guy, an older lady pled. Jason Keller's not poor, I can tell you that, another mumbled. More comments rose up over the crowd, urging her to give him a chance. Jason's pulse had taken up residence in the high-speed zone. He tugged his shirt from his chest to get some air and willed himself to look at ease. At last, Marley's shoulders dropped in defeat. She snatched the mic from Bob, her forehead scrunched up in irritation. The same rules apply, then. Back by 11 and all that. Jason brought his arm up to make a square. Scout's honor. Thank heavens, Gramps took him to Scouts in his youth so he could lean on the phrase because it seemed to impress her, at least for a second as her face softened the slightest bit. Her lip twitched, an action Jason fixed his gaze on as she went to speak. Yes, Just say yes, you beautiful, stubborn woman. The truth was, if she'd have simply engaged with him some polite conversation at the Trout farm, all this could have been avoided. She'd practically forced him into taking the drastic measure. Fine, she finally snapped. Sold. Bob ran to where he'd left his mallet. He slammed it down hard as the crowd cheered. A flood of triumph rushed into Jason's chest like hot air in a balloon. He pumped a fist and grinned. Yes. Taylor blew out a whistle and turned to him. Looks like you got yourself one ticked-off date. He nodded to Marley a second before she bolted into the crowd. Jason grinned, still shocked that he'd actually gotten a yes out of her. I think you're right. Hopefully she won't be ticked off for long.
Chapter 2. Marley spun around full circle before her mirror, a fresh wave of dread washing over her. She could not believe she'd gotten sucked into a date with a cocky city boy, one with Hollywood ties, no less. What could be worse? Thinks he can just swoop in with all his money and good looks and get anything he wants, she grumbled while scrutinizing her reflection. Was her outfit a good choice for an anniversary party? And was that really what Jason Keller wanted to do with the date he'd paid so much money for? She'd pictured him pulling up in a limo, escorting her to a tarmac where they'd board a private jet, all to dine in some quaint little cafe overlooking the water. Not that she wanted that. Marlee Jenkins lived for the simple life. But an anniversary party that started at 2 in the afternoon, which was just 12 minutes away, she realized? If Jason kept her until her self-appointed 11 p.m. curfew, their date could last 9 whole hours. A bit of quick math said that was over 500 minutes. Of course, only some of that time would be spent at the party he mentioned. According to Jason, the dress code called for boots and jeans. It just seemed too country for a guy who'd been raised as part of the world-famous Keller family. Everyone knew who Michael Keller was. The plastic surgeon starring in his own reality TV show called Beauty and the Keller Beast. According to tabloids and town talk alike, the man was furious when his only son quit his med school pursuit to become a ranch hand out in the country, especially since the famous surgeon planned to have Jason join him on the show once he graduated. Marley had figured Jason would grow tired of ranch life within the first year or so, but that hadn't happened. She forced her mind back to her outfit. The turquoise top seemed too cheery for the occasion. Quickly, she unbuttoned the blouse, shrugged out of it, and tossed it onto the heap of rejects at the foot of her bed. She hurried back to her closet and gripped a cluster of hangers. Just as she prepared to slide them to one side, giggles sounded from beyond her window. She froze in place, muscles tightening, and cringed. Great. Britt and Lily were home. Marley had purposefully given her sisters extra chores at the Trout farm in hopes that they wouldn't get back until she was gone. Either they'd finish the spare jobs early or pass them on to Stone, the new guy Marley hired to work on weekends. Of course that's what they'd done. Like the poor kid could actually say no to the likes of Britt and Lily. She tugged a sweater off its padded hanger and sighed as an image of her date floated to mind. Talk about hard to say no to. Jason Keller, with all his good looks and Hollywood clout, had probably never learned the meaning of the word, which was why Marley had wanted so badly to teach him in front of the entire town of Phillipsburg. But she couldn't do it while denying the very family she was raising money for an extra $1,000, not to mention Dad's charity. Jason Keller was probably the one sneaking all that extra cash into the jar at the Trout farm each week. Normally, that would be to someone's credit. So why, with Jason, did she have to dismiss it so entirely? A vision of her mother rushed in, reminding her of exactly why. He had a direct tie to Hollywood and all its misplaced values. She pictured the way Jason had stood there at the auction, a cocky grin on his gorgeous face as he awaited her reply. It caused a dose of heat to break out over her skin every time. And if she were honest, it also sparked a delicious stir in her chest. the vain thrill of being the object of his desire. But that's all it was, vain, because Jason didn't even know her. Marley shoved her arms into the sleeves of the neglected sweater and carefully, so as not to disturb her hair, pulled it over her head. A knock came to her door. A second later, the thing burst open. "Let's see what you're wearing," Britt said. "Oh no," Lily blurted as they dashed into the room. "You can't wear that old thing." Marley rolled her eyes and smoothed the hem around her waist. "I can if I want to." Though one look in the mirror and she agreed. As timeless as she'd thought the sweater to be, the stretched wool and loose neck suddenly looked outdated and frumpy. Brittany ran straight for Marley's closet, hollering over her shoulder as she moved. "Let's find something to bring out the blue in your eyes." "You guys know I don't care about stuff like that," Marley said. "You should," Lily mumbled under her breath. Britt barreled out of the closet as quickly as she'd moved to it, and breezed past Marley and Lily empty-handed. She disappeared down the hall. "I've got the perfect thing," she explained. "Holy smokes," Lily squealed. "He's going to be here in like 10 minutes. The excitement in Lily's tone forced a streak of nervous energy right down the back of Marley's neck. She pulled in a deep breath and held it. "Relax, Marley. You don't even like this guy." "You're going to give him a chance, aren't you?" Lily asked once Britt left. "I don't even know what that means," Marley said, hoping to end the conversation before Brittany came back. The last thing she needed was the two ganging up on her. "Oh, yes, you do," Marley said with all the gusto she used while performing in the town's musical. "It might have been fun to play the bullheaded trout for a while, but if you keep doing it, you're going to be alone for the rest of your life." "It's bull trout, not bullheaded trout," Marley corrected. "Well, bullheaded sounds better since that's what you are." "You don't need to lecture her," Britt said as she burst back into the room. "Dad gave her that nickname as a joke. And now she's just going to swim around trying to dodge every gorgeous guy who asks her out, including the biggest catch in town, Jason Keller." Lily flopped back onto the bed. "Which means he'll be available for us to date." "Right," Brittany nodded to Marley's sweater. "Take that off." "Geez, Miss Bossy." Marley grumbled as she carefully pried the thing off her head. She flung it toward the growing pile on her bed and missed. Maybe Marley had been charmed by Dad's nickname. A name inspired by a few rare bull trout that somehow snuck into their reservoir years back. Season after season, those bull trout lived on, seeming to avoid every hook that might snare them. They were clever, savvy, and evasive. Best of all, they never got jerked around. "Put this camisole on first." Britt thrust a silky tank top into her hand. As soon as she had that on, Britt handed her the blouse. "This rusty orange color will make your eyes pop." Marley shrugged into the sheer top and began to button it. "Geez, do you own every color of top known to man?" "Better," Britt quipped while lifting her brows. "I own every color of top known to woman." She took a step back and gasped. "Wow, that does look incredible on you." "It really does," Lily added, her tone laced with reverence. Marley eyed her sisters. They were truly beautiful, and they were much better at keeping up with makeup and fashion trends, getting their hair done with highlights and trendy cuts, while Marley lived in ponytails and baseball caps. But as she turned to look in the full-length mirror, her hair falling around her shoulders, Marley saw a very different woman. "This really does make my eye color pop." It made her skin look better, too. Gave her more of an olive complexion. She shot a surprised look at Britt. "You really should go to cosmetology school. You're so good at all this." Britt shrugged. "Some people say we should wear spring-like colors when it's spring, but what we should really focus on is what complements us, not the season." She reached out and undid the top two buttons and pulled a gold chain off her arm. "This area right here, around your collarbone, neck, and the upper chest is called your clavicle. The Jenkins girls have pretty clavicles that are meant to be seen." "Especially since we hardly have any boobs," Lily grumbled. "Speak for yourself," Britt snapped. A B cup is perfectly respectable. She came up behind Marley and clasped the thin gold chain at the back of her neck. Marley took hold of the tiny heart-shaped pendant before letting it fall just above the camisole. It really did look pretty. Looks like you already put some blush on, Britt said as she came around to look at her. Did you? Marley shot a hesitant glance at Lily before answering. A little. Oh my gosh, I knew you secretly liked him. I mean, it's Jason Keller. No woman's immune to his charms, not even the old Weatherly twins. 3 distinct knocks sounded from the front door, exuding all the hype of trumpets announcing royalty. The chatter ceased. All movement, too. Even Marley was holding her breath. But only heaven knew why. Her insides went wild. Heart hammering, pulse racing, muscles clenching. Heat poured onto her face like she just leaned over a dozen mugs of morning coffee. Holy smokes, Lily hissed, breaking into the stillness. He's here! Britt's declaration came out somewhere between a whisper and a shout. In a flurry of dashing limbs and flying hair, the duo made for the hall and raced toward the door, leaving Marley in the room with her own reflection. She half expected it to be blurry with how frantically her heart was beating. A noise carried down the hall, and Marley tipped her head to tune into it. Laughter. Jason's, actually. It had been a while since the sound of a man's hearty laugh echoed down those halls. A wave of warmth rippled over Marley's arms, and just like that, the deep, raspy chuckle snuck right past her defenses and nestled into a quiet spot in her heart. It felt nice there, like a combination of heat and hope. Marley, Lily hollered. Your date's here. Her boy-crazy little sister giggled loudly. Not gonna lie, he looks really good. What a flirt. Marley rolled her eyes. Why hadn't Jason just bid on one of her sisters? Both Lily and Britt were interested in dating, a pastime Marley usually avoided at all costs. Still, she squared her shoulders, took one final look in the mirror, and blew out a shaky breath. Suddenly, a realization sank in. The necklace, the one Britt had given her, was Mom's. Marley's hand shot to her throat. Quickly, she tugged one side of the thin chain until the clasp was in front, then pinched the small lever to unlatch it. If the stupid piece of jewelry weren't special to Britt, Marley would chuck it in the toilet and flush it. The last thing she wanted to carry was a reminder of the mother who'd abandoned them for her own selfish pursuits. Instead, she rested it next to her jewelry box and turned out the light. Yet, as Marley stepped into the hallway, she wondered if it wouldn't have been a bad idea to wear it after all. The token might help her remember how strong the pulls of fame and fortune really were. Just because someone left the lifestyle behind didn't mean they wouldn't go back, even if they had to leave the ones they were supposed to love most. She wouldn't need a gold chain to remind her of that. Marley had treated enough late-night fevers, attended enough of Britt's soccer games and Lily's choir concerts to sear the warning right into her brain. The latest images were razor-sharp and new scab fresh, even if they were from 2 years ago. Caring for Dad. All but forgotten by the woman he'd sworn his devotion to, while he suffered through one taxing treatment after the next. No, she'd learned the lesson quite well. People who'd had a taste of fame were destined to seek it once more, and that included Jason Keller. "Comin'," she called. A few short steps led her through the hall and into the foyer where her date for the night stood. Tall, gorgeous, and more muscled than she'd realized, the Keller Cowboy, a nickname bestowed by tabloids, set his eyes on her. "Hi," he crooned. "You look beautiful." The comment was met with some awes by her sisters to fill Marley's face with another dose of heat. Or perhaps it was the discovery of a small dimple in Jason's cheek that made her blush. Whoa, she was fooling herself if she couldn't admit this guy had hands down the most attractive smile, jaw, face, and now dimple she'd ever seen in person. She gulped, forcing herself to lift her lowered chin back into place. "Hi," she squeaked. "Thank you. You, too, look nice, I mean." Lily giggled some more. Marley shot her a warning glare before eyeing Jason once more. Hesitantly then, as if she were walking the Green Mile, she forced herself to step closer to Jason and the door that would lead them into their 540-minute-long date. One step closer. 2. Dang, he smelled good. Like a live-in cologne ad for cowboys. All spice and musk and rugged good looks. She took another cautious step. If she didn't know better, Marley might actually think Jason had been cowboying his whole life. The famous Keller hadn't been born there, but that hadn't stopped him from taking on the rugged quality that made cowboys so appealing. A well-defined muscular frame that was more lean than bulk, and the ability to wear a cowboy hat and jeans like he'd been born for 'em. Even that 5 o'clock shadow he wore was more country than city, where men often favored a clean shave. Marley stopped a few feet shy of him, reminding herself that he was in fact a wolf in cowboy's clothing. A look of curiosity had replaced the smile on Jason's face. But as his gaze dropped to the space between them, a good 1.5 feet of gray ceramic tile and white grout, a slight tug pulled at one side of his mouth. She watched him, with curiosity of her own, as Jason moved his gaze up her frame, slowly, until it rested on her face. The room went warm. He kept his eyes fixed on her, thoughtful still before unleashing the power of that full grin once again. A broad smile with white, sparkling teeth. Were those goosebumps forming along her arms? Suddenly, in one smooth stride, he closed the gap between them and nodded to her sisters in turn. "I'll have her back by 11. "Oh, you can keep her all night long as far as we're concerned," Britt said. Marley was about to reply with a snide comment when Jason flattened a hand along her lower back. "M'lady," he crooned. Whoa. She was positive there'd been some sort of comeback on the tip of her tongue, but for the life of her, Marley couldn't recall it. Couldn't recall who she'd even speak to if it did come to mind, because all she could focus on in that moment was the warm and steady sensation of Jason's palm through the thin fabric of her blouse. Geez, she really was deprived if a simple hand on her back could stir such a response. A small voice repeated the sentiment as the truth of it sank in. She better keep her wits about her today. If she wasn't careful, Marley could wind up crushing on the Keller Cowboy like every other female in town. In the front yard, the bright sun cast moving shadows over the grass as they walked towards Jason's truck. "Did you hear that?" He opened the passenger door. "Your sister said we could stay out later if you'd like." Marley forced her eyes off the driveway and looked up to catch a wry smile on his face. Her heart skipped at least 3 full beats. 11 o'clock is perfect, she assured. "Suit yourself." Jason's smile only grew. He waited for her to buckle up, then gently closed the door, and as he circled around the back of the truck, Marley could swear she heard that low, raspy chuckle once more. Dang. She really was in trouble. Chapter 3. Jason couldn't wipe the grin off his face. Sure, it wasn't polite to revel in his victory, but he'd been dying to go out with Marley Jenkins for a long time now. And here she was, making the passenger side of his Tundra truck look better than it had since he bought it. Her blue eyes were hypnotizing today, their reflective nature capturing the green from the fields as they passed. He couldn't believe the woman he'd been secretly aching for a solid year was actually here with him. Taylor's comment from the auction floated to his mind. "Looks like you got yourself one ticked-off date." By the looks of Marley's narrowed gaze, the serious set of her brow, and the unwilling way she'd neared him at her front door, Jason would say that held true. But there was only one sure way to find out. "So, have you forgiven me yet?" he asked. Marley held a casual-looking glance out the window, but she turned to him as she waited for his reply. Gorgeous olive skin, warm cheeks, and that deep mystery in her eyes. All of it lit a fire low in his belly. "The, auction? Have you forgiven me yet for springing that on you?" He draped one hand over the steering wheel as he stopped at the sign. Was it just him, or were those pretty cheeks growing pinker? "Forgiven you?" she asked in a high-pitched, I didn't see that coming tone. She bit her lip, chuckled slightly, and then gave in to one of the most beautiful smiles he'd seen. Jason didn't even know what she'd say yet, but already he was grinning back like a fool. "I don't really have time for dating, that's all." "So what would you be doing today?" he asked. "Instead of this, I mean. You don't work on Saturdays." Oh, shoot. He shouldn't have shown that he knew that. Marley did a double take, and Jason forced his eyes back on the intersection, pulling onto the road once he saw it was clear. "Right," she said softly. "I don't work on Saturdays, but I've got all that spring cleaning stuff to take care of with the house and the yard. My dad, even up to the last few months of his life, was taking care of things I didn't even know needed to be done. Cleaning out the... What are those things around the roof? Gutters." Jason was too familiar with this himself, having just bought a home for his own last year. He nodded. "Right. Rain gutters. Plus I do a vegetable garden. I haven't even planted peas or lettuce this year. In fact, I've got last year's tomato corpses all shriveled up in their cages waiting for me to bury them. It's sad." Jason chuckled. "That is sad." Also sad was the realization that he was the reason she wasn't making progress on the chores today. "So far, I've been focusing on deep cleaning and going through a few neglected boxes in the garage. Stuff my dad left behind." Jason couldn't imagine going through the boxes of a loved one after they were gone. "It's a lot of work running a house of your own," he said, focusing on that instead. "Plus, you've got your sisters to look after. That can't be easy." He glanced over in time to catch Marley's shoulders soften. "Yeah, stinkers," she said. "They should be helping me with all the house stuff, and I do have them help out on a few things. But they're young. I want them to go out and have fun." Man, she sounded like his sister Peyton. How she used to be anyway. Take care of everyone else. Shelve your own happiness at all costs. "What about you?" Jason was probably stepping over a line, but he couldn't help it. Marley stiffened. "What about me?" He shrugged, blew out a paced breath as his own irritation rose. Why people couldn't recognize that they mattered too, he'd never understand. His own actions might have been deemed selfish where his escape from the Keller lifestyle was concerned. But Jason viewed it as not only survival, but also the pursuit of happiness. "You're still young," he said. "You should go out, have a good time too, right? At least sometimes." She shrugged. "I have a different personality. I'm the type who's fine being alone." That comment was no better than the other. His irritation kicked up a notch. A million retorts shot to his mind, but he forced himself to stay quiet for 2 whole seconds. And then the frustration won out. "I don't mind being alone either sometimes," he said, angry heat burning in his chest. "But anyone who says they never get lonely is either lying or kidding themselves." "I never said I don't get lonely," she snapped. The engine got louder, probably because he'd revved it in lieu of speaking up again. But what was this? She'd just admitted to feeling lonely? "My sisters keep me company," Marley added. "And then there's the Trout farm. I'm friends with, everyone in town." Her tone had changed, more wistful now. "They fill me in on the latest while I fillet their catch of the day. It's nice. I guess that's why I never minded stepping in when Britt and Lily had a hard time with the dirty work, cutting out guts and all that. Gave me a chance to hear if Gary Bond's son made it into the fancy university he applied to, or if the Gerald's baby girl was doing better after a terrible cold." He liked that side of her, but couldn't help but think of how she'd never shown that sort of interest in him. It was obvious that Marley made herself scarce every time Jason approached the small shack, bucket in hand. "If it weren't for the Trout farm," Marley continued, "I wouldn't know who needed help when auction time came around. So I guess you could say the folks in town The people who frequent the Trout farm, they're like family.
All except for me, he wanted to say, but he bit his tongue as she continued.
They love my dad. Always asked about him when he cut back on his hours to do treatments. Plus, they know about my mom.
About her mom. He knew about her mom, too. She was a famous soap opera star. But the way Marley said it made Jason wonder if there was more to it than that.
How long ago did your father pass, if you don't mind me asking?
2 years ago now. Jason nodded.
I'm sorry about your loss. I didn't have the privilege to meet him. Taylor and Luke had been trying to get me to go to the Trout farm with them since I moved here 4 years ago, but I kept telling them I didn't like fish.
She twisted in the seat and shot him a look. You don't?
Didn't. At least, that's what I thought since my parents never made me try it. I just had that idea in my head. But then I came in after a long day of work and got an invite from Dee to come to dinner. Fresh trout with mashed red potatoes and a lemon herb hollandaise sauce. Had I not been so starving, I might not have tried it.
He shook his head, glanced in the rear view, then sped up to pass a slow-moving tractor.
I couldn't believe how good it was. And here I'd been missing out on it my whole life. That's when I started going up there and catching my own.
He glanced over in time to see a triumphant-looking grin on her face. I love fresh fish, and I love it when people learn to enjoy it as an adult. There's something satisfying about it. He smiled.
Keeps you in business, too.
Yes, she said through a small laugh. It sure does. He thought back on how they'd started this conversation, of the way Marley had bristled when he challenged her about getting lonely. Things had diffused nicely, but only because he hadn't confronted her about the way she gave him the cold shoulder when he came around. Do you miss your parents? She asked. Or does having Peyton here make up for it? It was the first time she'd acknowledged knowing anything about him.
Having Peyton here is everything, especially now that they have Gunner. The little guy is something else, starting walking just last week. I love being an uncle.
He put his mind back on her original question.
But as far as my parents, we have a better relationship now than we ever did when I lived in California. I think because they finally stopped trying to control my life and accepted that I never wanted the future they wanted for me.
Memories of that difficult time poured in. The struggle to break free from that heavy burden of fame and the endless list of expectations that came along with it. It took him a moment to notice in the quietness that Marley was studying him. He shot her a glance. His face was thoughtful, the deep blue of her eyes seeming to hold beautiful secrets he'd probably never come to know. The thought sparked a longing deep in his chest. He wanted very badly to know this woman. He wanted to know how he'd managed to end up on her crap list without even doing a thing.
You don't like me, he said softly. How come?
He'd set his eyes back on the road now, but he sensed her discomfort upon his saying it. I don't not like you, she said. The hesitation in her denial was glaring.
Wow, he chuckled. That was convincing.
Jason leaned into the seat, angling himself toward her.
Do you want to know one of the things I like about you?
Her eyes widened.
I like that, unlike most women, you're not enamored with me because of who I am.
That thoughtful expression was back on her face again. So, that's an issue for you. Women wanting to go out with the famous Jason Keller. He nodded.
Yup. And I always know. The second they start talking about California and why would I want to be in a boring old town working hard labor on a ranch instead of being pampered in L.A., that's when I know I'm on a date with a woman I'd never want to marry. I don't want to be with someone who's in love with who I used to be, or what my old life represents. I don't want to be with a woman who doesn't want to be here.
A quick glance at Marley said she hadn't moved a muscle.
That's why I've taken interest in you, he continued. You're definitely not enamored with the Jason Keller of L.A.
which I think is a very good thing. But can I ask you a tiny little favor?
His heart tripled in rhythm as he waited for a reply. She licked those pouty lips of hers and shrugged.
Sure.
It came out in a whisper.
Give me, the Jason Keller of Phillipsburg, a chance. You may find that I'm not so bad.
The slightest hint of a smile pulled at one corner of her full lips.
We've got the entire day together, he added. Might as well open up, get to know me, and have some fun. What do you say?
Chapter 4. Wow. Marley hadn't thought in a million years that Jason might do this. This being the way he'd called her on her crap, as Dad used to say. And now he was asking her to give him a chance? It was such a straightforward thing to ask that it took her by surprise. Jason's brown eyes held a hint of amusement, like they had when they were by the front door. But she detected something else, too. Vulnerability. For the second time that day, he'd managed to puncture another piece of her heart. She gulped and forced herself to nod. Okay. Jason gave her a satisfied nod as that dimple sank right back into his cheek. Swirls and twirls of heat fluttered over her skin. Sheesh. That grin should be illegal. She set her gaze back out the window. Marley hadn't ever considered the fact that all of his Keller status might actually play against him. Of course it would to someone who wanted to escape it. To someone who had a genuine desire to find a woman who'd love him outside the very cocoon he was trying to shed. She couldn't help but feel as if an entirely different man sat beside her now. When she'd climbed into his truck just 10 minutes ago, he'd been, in her mind, LA's Jason Keller. But to know that he didn't like using his status as an advantage, and to know that what he liked most about her was that she wasn't influenced by it, that made a difference. What he might not know, and perhaps this didn't make her any better, is that she was influenced by that status. It just had the opposite effect on her. Instead of drawing her in, it repelled her to the point that she'd been rude. You don't like me. She cringed, hating that it had been so obvious. She felt bad for giving him the cold shoulder this whole time, but at least she was giving him a chance now. But a chance at friendship? Or at romance? The question scattered her thoughts like ashes in a windstorm. What a dumb thing to ask herself. Of course he'd have to settle for friendship like anyone else. Romance was not in the cards for Marley. Still, at the mere idea of becoming romantically involved with Jason, a rush of heat pooled into her face and heart and hands. She felt like some young, dumb teenager. A mess of hormones and emotions she hadn't experienced in quite some time. Heck, it had been over 3 years since she'd gone on an official pick-me-up-at-7 type of date. Sure, a few men in town had insisted they take her for a bite to eat after a long shift, but she'd never agreed to anything beyond that. Tom Wilkinson, that's who she'd gone out with last. It was such a vivid time in her mind. The time when her world started to crumble. Tommy had asked her out on a Wednesday. Dad's diagnosis came on Thursday. And the date was set for Friday. Marley had attempted to cancel. She just wanted to stay home with her family and circle the wagons. Come up with a foolproof way for Dad to beat the rare form of cancer. But Dad wouldn't hear of it. "Don't you dare go canceling that date, hun," he'd said. "You need to keep living your life no matter what happens with mine." His face had turned stern then. "Promise me." Marley had gone on the date as promised, but she'd known even then that it'd be the last date she'd go on until Dad recovered. And when his health declined instead, it became even more clear. It was her job to be present in the home and do the things Mom should have been there to do. Take care of Dad. Watch after her teenage sisters. Make sure they didn't use the tragedy as an excuse to go wild. Britt went through a short, rebellious stint anyway. And Lily, heck, that girl was born boy crazy. But they'd made it through. We're still making it through. Which was why she shouldn't let herself get involved in a relationship. So there. She'd come full circle. Yes, she'd give Jason a shot at friendship, but nothing more. Marley repeated those very words as they pulled onto the Branson family ranch. When I first heard that you came to work for the Bransons, I thought it was for research or something, you know? So you could play the role of some ruggedly handsome cowboy with a chip on his shoulder. Jason shot her a look. You think I'm ruggedly handsome? She didn't bother replying. He knew he was. What made you leave everything behind and move out here? Jason shut off the engine and tossed the keys into his cupped palm. Since I was young, I knew the role I was supposed to play. I was one of the Kellers. My mom's one of the biggest names in fashion, right? And here comes Peyton, and she's just on fire. She hits the runway running, if you know what I mean. She created her own fashion line and made a name for herself before I was even out of my teens. He shifted in his seat and fixed his gaze on her, hints of gold shimmering in the depths of his brown eyes. Phillipsburg Jason, she reminded herself. That's impressive, she said. But really she was thinking about how much she liked this side of him already. You said it, Jason said. And here my dad is, some famous plastic surgeon starring in his own show, so what does that mean? Oh, that I have to go to med school? Follow in his footsteps and become the newest star in Beauty and the Keller Beast? Well, he would have changed it to Beast once I came on. He shifted his gaze to look over a distant field. I wanted the simple life ever since I could remember. I used to watch westerns with my granddad, and I'd dream about climbing on a horse and galloping over the land. I wanted it, but I also knew I'd never have it. Until this one day when I was messing around on the web looking for something to do during the summer break. I'd graduated high school early with an associate's actually and was working on my pre-med classes. Anyway, as I'm checking out different vacation spots, I don't even know how, but I see this ad posted about ranch hands for hire. And I just knew. He turned back to her, a fresh intensity in his eyes. My whole body knew. Has that ever happened to you? Marley shook her head absently, intrigued by the passion she saw in him. He hadn't been some rebellious punk like the media made him out to be. My entire life felt like a prison almost. I mean, I was free in one sense, of course, but it was understood that I would do what my father did. So, to break them in, I told my parents I'd just try ranching for the summer, you know? That was only so I could ease them into it gently. I knew I was never going back to that life. Wow. It came out in a whisper. That was brave of you. He grinned. Thank you for saying so. Not everyone sees it that way. My parents, they're divorced since, but they're both remarried and they seem pretty happy now too. Happier than they were, I think. A vision of his also-famous sister came to mind. The woman had shocked the media by marrying Luke Branson, who was Jason's boss at the time. I can't believe Peyton left too, she said. What, did she just meet Luke when she came down for a visit once? Jason pointed at her and lifted his brows. That's a good question. Stay there. He shoved open his door and climbed out, shutting it before hurrying over to her side. He cracked open her door and offered his hand. That illegal smile spread over his face. Marley rested her hand in his, welcoming the tingles that skipped through her skin at his touch. The weather was perfect out today. Sunlight, warmth, not even a hint of the cold breeze that often made springtime so chilly. When I left, Jason continued, it caused a big upset in the family. When I refused to come back, it got worse. Poor Peyton was trying to salvage our reputation and save our family from falling apart all at once, most of which she blamed me for at the time. So, she showed up late one night,
demanding that I come home with her. I refused, of course.
He chuckled and shook his head.
So when that didn't work, she actually told Luke he needed to fire me, which he refused to do. She was getting a lot of no's that night. Needless to say, she and Luke did not hit it off at first. But Luke, the caring boss that he was, encouraged Peyton to stick around and see what it is I'd do before she made judgments about it. Long story short, the two fell in love.
Fell in love. Just like her parents. Of course, Mom gave up the life she always wanted only to resent it 7 years and 3 kids later. Would Peyton do the same? Stop it, Marley. Get Mom out of your head and quit assuming the worst about everyone. Obviously, she'd been wrong about Jason this whole time. The backyard was alive with all sorts of excitement. Games, food, a whole lot of chatter.
This, Jason said under his breath, is my family of choice.
Marley took in the crowd of people, realizing what a large family the Bransons had. It made celebrations at the Jenkins home seem pitiful in comparison. Jason wasted no time introducing her to the few guests she wasn't yet acquainted with, and soon they settled into a shaded spot on the patio beside his sister. "How about you get Marley and me some of Dee's famous slush?" Peyton suggested, shifting her weight from one side to the next as her baby clung to her hip. Boy, was he cute. Full, pouty cheeks, big brown eyes, and a swirl of auburn hair that was closer in color to Jason's than his mom's. Jason looked at Marley.
"Would you like some slush?"
"Sure, thank you." Peyton hoisted baby Gunner from her hip. "Oh, and take this little guy with you, will you?" Jason clapped his hands before holding them out, his face transforming into a dopey grin.
"You want to come with Uncle JJ, huh?"
His voice had changed too, silly and scratchy like a cartoon character's. That secret corner in Marley's heart, the one Jason kept managing to sneak into, did flips at the sight of him in uncle mode. Gunner squealed and kicked his feet.
"Yay! Yay! Yay!"
"That's right," Jason said proudly.
He shot Marley a wink.
"Be right back."
Marley replayed that wink in her mind at least 4 times before Peyton came into focus. Of all the people she knew at the gathering, Marley was least familiar with Peyton. The pretty redhead leaned in and covered the side of her mouth conspiratorially. "I'm so happy Jason asked you out on a date," she said through a wry smile. "Who cares if he paid for it? At least he has good taste." "Oh, thank you." Marley squinted against a ray of sun that pierced through the branches overhead. Guilt pierced through in a similar fashion. "I appreciate that. And I appreciate him donating so much money to the Inglesons and toward Charlie's cause, too." It might have seemed like a hollow statement, but it wasn't. Marley was truly grateful for the generous donations he'd made. "You know," Peyton said, "I've been here for close to 4 years now. But I swear I still have to pinch myself that this is actually my life." The warm depth in her brown eyes reminded her of Jason. "I'm so glad that we're raising our family here. My kids will never know the kind of lifestyle and pressures Jason and I had growing up." Marley couldn't deny the authenticity she sensed in those words. Was that what Jason was hoping for too? To raise a family out here in the country? She grinned. "Yeah, that's wonderful." But something was happening. The words "raising our family" got snagged on a rusty, jagged blade Marley hadn't even known was there. Did she ever plan to raise a family of her own? Or did she just plan to sit back and watch Britt and Lily live a life she'd opted out of? Her gaze drifted over the crowded backyard. 2 picnic tables held bowls, pots, and casserole dishes filled with everything from potato salad to baked beans. The round table close by tempted guests with fresh cinnamon rolls, raspberry cobbler, and Jell-O hidden beneath thick layers of whipped cream. The food and the games and the fun seemed to stretch on for miles. And laughter. When was the last time she'd heard so much of it in one place? Or seen so many smiles? Or felt so much peace? Bob and Dee were teamed up with Taylor and his brother Ross, racing hovercrafts from one end of the yard to the next. The school-age grandchildren were busy swinging lassos over their heads and hurling them toward the stationary bull named Mabel, a game they called rope a bull by the horns. And there was Jason, standing beside the dessert table. He'd run into Luke there, and the two were spooning a drippy bite of bright pink slushy into Gunner's mouth from a plastic cup. Gunner puckered his little lips before bursting into a smile.
More!
The little guy cheered as it dripped down his chin. The men chuckled, and Luke readied the spoon for another taste. So cute, Marley said under her breath. No wonder Jason called these guys his family of choice. It's amazing, isn't it? Marley blushed, feeling as if Peyton had read her mind. Still, she couldn't stop the swell of warmth and hope that rose in her chest. Yeah, she gulped back the knot in her throat. It's wonderful. A large banner had been strung between two trees to mark the celebration. Colorful balloons clung to the corners while paint-blotched handprints lined the edges. The words, "Happy 40th Anniversary," took up the center. Some families really did stick together, didn't they? "Ice-cold slushies for your refreshment," Jason said as he returned. He handed one to Marley and Peyton in turn. "Luke took Gunner in for a diaper change. He wanted me to ask if the diaper bag is inside." Peyton sucked air through her clenched teeth and set down her cup. "Shoot. No, I left it in the car. I better grab it." She gave Marley a nod. "We'll talk more later. Oh, and before I forget to have you do this." She snatched Jason's cowboy hat off his head and hid it behind her back. Jason raked his fingers through his auburn waves. "What are you doing?" "This," Peyton said, lifting her hand to toss his hair from one side to the next. "This hair is one of Jason's best features. You have to run your hands through it at least once." Jason rolled his eyes. "Can I have my hat back?" "Only if you promise to let her play with your hair first." He gave Peyton an exhausted look that only a fellow sibling could relate to. Peyton grinned at Marley. "Promise me you'll try it just once and I'll give him his hat." Jason turned a set of pleading eyes to Marley. Her heart reacted to the sight before she could even speak. Head lowered, a young-looking pout on his handsome face. "You've got to save me here. I have hat head." She tilted her head to see if that was true. His hair wasn't long by any means, but it wasn't short either, the tips falling along his dark brows. Sure enough, a small dent played across the strands toward the ends. "You can't really tell since your hair is kind of wavy anyway." She glanced back at his sister. "But yes, I promise to feel his hair, Peyton." "You'll thank me for it." Peyton smiled and shoved the hat into Jason's hand before darting toward the patio steps. "I'll be back." "Thanks for warning us," Jason mumbled. He turned to Marley, rested the hat over one fist, and moved his gaze slowly back to her face. Her heart pounded out an extra beat as warmth rushed into her cheeks. She took a sip of the tangy slush, hoping to counter the flash of heat. "You don't have to play with my hair if you don't want to," he mumbled, looking even more boyish now as he looked at her through his lashes. "Peyton's weird about stuff like that. She's so proud to be a redhead that she thinks everyone should be enamored with it." Marley grinned, enjoying his discomfort in a way. "A promise is a promise." It felt as if her heart had multiplied in her chest, as if there were a dozen tiny extra hearts hammering in there as well. She rested her slush cup beside Peyton's and, with a tentative hand, reached up and hovered it over his head. There was no backing out now. "He likes you, Marley," she reminded herself. "He donated $2,000 to go out with you." She let the thrill of that thought urge her on, and at last, Marley pushed her fingers through the gorgeous waves. She slid the tips of her fingers along the parts in his auburn hair while the strands caught streaks of sunlight. Only then did the copper color shine through. It really was a nice head of hair for a man. "I think it has more to do with the feel of your hair than the color," she said, moving her hands through it once more. The thick strands were cool and smooth as they slid through her fingers. She glanced down to see a trail of goosebumps rise over Jason's arms. "Does that feel good?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jason chuckled under his breath and made a purring sound.
"Yes," he admitted. "When you do it, it does."
Heaven help her. But she liked having that kind of effect on him. The idea caused an entirely new thrill to shoot through her. Jason lifted his chin until his eyes met hers. The delicious sensation grew and swelled as he held her gaze. It took Marley a moment to identify what was causing it. Chemistry. That's what this was. That magnetic spark of potential. It had been forever since she'd felt anything like it. She found herself giving him a flirtatious smile as she raked through his hair one last time, starting just above his forehead. Her fingertips pressing firmly now. It reminded her of high school in a way, the forgotten feelings of attraction stirring within her. She'd missed it. "I told you he had a great head of hair," Peyton came from behind. Marley yanked her hand back. Jason cleared his throat and shoved the hat back on his head. Peyton looked back and forth between them pointedly. "I think I hear Luke calling for help again." She gave them a tight-lipped smile and popped her brows. "I'll catch up with you two later." His sister walked away, leaving the two of them standing there, the disrupted dust of desire still swirling about looking for a place to land.
"That was subtle."
Jason shook its head and took hold of her hand.
"Come on. Let's see if we can ring the rope around good old Mabel."
Bob and Dee had moved on from the drones and were lined up for the roping game as well.
"How you doing, doll?" Bob boomed as they neared. "Is Jason treating you right?"
"So far, so good," Marley admitted.
"And now he's challenging you to a match?"
Marley glanced at Jason in question. "I don't know. Are you?" He puffed his broad chest.
"Of course."
Bob leaned toward Marley.
"Psst. You do know he ropes animals for a living, right? He's dang good at it, too. A natural."
"Should have seen him last year at the rodeo," Dee added proudly. "He placed in 3 different categories." Marley could picture it now. Jason riding on horseback while swinging that rope over his head, or balancing atop a wild bull while it kicked and thrashed. The vision stirred memories of the first time she'd ever been to a rodeo. She sure knew how to crush on cowboys back then. Seemed Jason was reviving that tendency with a vengeance.
"How about we team up?" Bob suggested. "I'll have Marley on my team, since I'm not too bad at it myself, and you take Dee on your team, Jason."
Dee scooted a set of turquoise bracelets up her wrist and cracked out a laugh.
"Poor Jason," she said. "I'm all thumbs when it comes to the rope."
She held up a finger.
"But you get me in the kitchen and there's no comparing, not even with the Weatherly twins." "You can say that again," Jason agreed, wrapping a loving arm around the woman.
It reminded Marley of the way he'd called her his second mother. He was sweet to her, and there was no doubt the couple had really grown to love Jason in return. Maybe he really was a safe bet. Heck, even the Branson family could vouch for him.
"Now," Bob said to her under his breath, "let's work up a plan to beat those guys."
Marley grinned. "You got it." Would they really be able to beat them, though? Inwardly, a bigger question came to mind. How would she beat the feeling she was starting to have for Montana's one and only Keller Cowboy? Chapter 5. Jason squeezed Marley's hand as they walked back to the truck. In another hour or so, the sun would set completely. For now, it hovered low along the horizon, spreading its evening glow over the land. The green, swaying fields soaked in the warm colors of sunlight, making the symmetric rows appear dreamlike. Phillipsburg offered some of the most breathtaking views he'd seen, but none could compete with the way Marley Jenkins looked in the evening sun. He had to remind himself several times that she was, in fact, there with him. He was one lucky dog. He glanced over, felt that heat dancing low in his belly, and gave her hand another squeeze as she smiled at him. "What's going through that mind of yours?" she asked, that subtle twang sweetening the words. He shrugged. "Just thinking that you were the perfect date for today." She grinned, the action accenting her high cheekbones. "Really?" he assured. "It's refreshing to be with a woman who knows how to enjoy herself in a setting like that. You even kicked my butt in roping. I'm going to take that up with Bob later," he added with a laugh. "He was a good teacher," she said. "But if I share a secret, do you promise not to tell him?" "Of course," Jason said. She leaned in closer, propped herself onto her toes, and brought her lips dangerously close to his earlobe. Heat roared low in his belly as her lips grazed his skin. "I liked it better when you showed me." At once he recalled the way he'd cupped her hip with one hand, wrapped his other around her slender wrist, and helped her get the rhythm of swinging the rope over her head. He'd like showing her too. But even more, he liked knowing that Marley felt something in those moments as well. After helping Marley climb into the truck, Jason leaned against the open door. "What sounds better to you? Going to dinner? You choose the restaurant. Or grabbing some takeout and going back to my place where I promise to be a perfect gentleman?" He put his hands up at either side of himself to prove it. Marley tipped her head and tapped her full lips with a finger. Both sound good." Dang, he liked hearing that too. "Why don't we do takeout at your place? That sounds nice." "My place it is," he said with a grin. Yet, as he rounded the truck, an errant thought snuck into his mind. A warning was more like it. This was all happening too easily. Perhaps Marley was just being polite, the way she was to all the folks in town. Dread crept in, enough to snuff out at least half of the hope he'd had only moments ago. What if he never found someone who'd love him for who he really was? And what if the chemistry between them was only one-sided? Jason hated how very possible that idea was. Well, politeness only went so far. If that's where her feelings ended, he was bound to find out before the night was through. Marley lifted her roasting stick to check the biscuit dough she'd wrapped around the whittled spear. She could see against the bright crackling flames that the biscuit had not only puffed up, but turned golden brown as well. "Oh, it looks perfect," Jason said. "That boy's ready for a butter bath." Marley giggled. "A butter bath it is." After testing the temperature with the tips of her fingers, she carefully pulled the freshly toasted treat off the stick and rested it in the pie tin of melted butter. Jason had demonstrated how it was done, since his was finished before hers. "There you go." Jason leaned in while watching her spin it to drench every side. "A nice dunk in the butter, now roll in the sugar and cinnamon, and it's ready to go." He handed over a plate just in time and reached for his. "Should we cheers?" Marley asked as they each lifted their doughboys off the plate. Jason gave her a sideways glance. She grinned. "Like this." Marley brought her treat close to his, gave it a small, muted tap, and said, "Cheers." A wide smile spread over his face, accented by the golden glow of dancing flames. "Cheers," he crooned in that low, sexy voice. Marley savored the blend of salty butter, warm biscuit, and the flavor of sweetened cinnamon. She licked the sugar granules off her fingertips and grinned. "That was amazing. I never thought anything could rival a toasted marshmallow," she said, "but that totally does." She watched for that magnificent smile of his to appear once more. It did, as bright and warm as the flames. A burst of heat fluttered in her chest. She liked Jason. Was liking him more by the minute. On their way to the anniversary party, Marley had agreed to give him a chance. Inwardly, she decided to only be open to friendship. But after spending the day with a man who was proving to be more kind, generous, and down-to-earth than she could have imagined, Marley had to admit she was interested in more than friendship. The acknowledgement was as thrilling as it was terrifying. Because what if this was just a different form of her? There was L.A. Jason and Phillipsburg Jason. What if he'd somehow discovered this whole other side of Marley, who loved the idea of finding love? She already knew the answer to that. Heck, it's not like she hadn't had crushes over the recent years, but nothing ever stuck. The truth was, whatever side of her had swam to the surface, it wouldn't last. Like Cinderella's magical spell, it would disappear at the stroke of midnight, or in this case, 11. "Should we do another one?" Jason asked. "Definitely." Marley reached for another piece of dough and began twisting it around the roasting stick. "So, how long ago did you buy this place?" Marley had been surprised to find that Jason now owned the Petersons' old ranch and farmhouse, a property they left behind when moving to Texas. "I bought it a year and a half ago. I did a good 6 months' worth of remodeling before moving in." He lowered his roasting stick to the base of the flames where spots of dark ash-colored coal glowed with cracks of red. "This is kind of a smaller ranch for Big Sky Country," she mused aloud. "It is," Jason said with a nod. "It's basically big enough that I can live out my fantasy of owning my own ranch without having to employ a bunkhouse full of ranch hands year-round." She glanced over at him. "But you do bring on a few, right?" "I do," he said. "About 3 or 4 during the busy seasons." A recollection was coming to mind. Marley remembered hearing that Jason had given Billy Connor and his son jobs when the factory downtown was temporarily out of commission. "You know," she said, hovering her roasting stick just above the flames, "a group of ladies at Sunday service were raving about you." She glanced over in time to see him raise a brow. "They were they?" The deep rasp of Jason's voice was the perfect fusion of sandpaper rough and worn leather smooth. Low, masculine, and 100% cowboy. "Mm-hmm. About how you saved the Connor family when they were out of work for a while. I think one of the Weatherly twins even called you a saint." Jason reached out, took a hold of her stick, and directed the tip to the spot his had been in moments ago. "Here's the best place," he said. "Give it a few slow spins, and before you know it, it'll be ready to go." When he pulled his hand away, Marley found herself leaning a little closer to close the gap. Jason set his gaze back on the fire. "I wouldn't say there are a whole lot of saints walking around these days, and of the few there are, I'm definitely not among them." Marley considered that. "So in your mind, what keeps you from being a saint?" He lifted an insinuative brow. "Aside from the not-so-pure thoughts I've been having about you?" he asked with a grin. "I did do one saintly deed not too long ago." "Oh yeah?" she asked, intrigued. "I stopped going to the 11 o'clock Sunday service and started going to the 9 o'clock one instead." Marley tipped her head. "Okay." He grinned, as if he half expected her to know where this was leading. She didn't have a clue. "I didn't do it for me. I did it for a woman who was avoiding me so fiercely that I feared she might stop going to service altogether over it." A recollection shot to her mind. "You offered me a seat," she said in a whisper. "I did." "And I didn't take it." "You ran," he said with a laugh. "I remember that now." A knot of guilt sank into her gut. "I honestly feared you'd stop coming altogether if you ran into me there again." Warmth danced around her heart as she took in what he said. "So even though you kinda liked me, and you wanted a chance to talk with me—" "Very much," he said with a nod. "Still you changed services so that you wouldn't scare me away from church." "Hey," he said, puffing out his chest. "Just trying to keep the man upstairs happy with me. He shrugged then and smiled.
That's probably the only saintly thing I've done.
Marley held his gaze as more dancing heat circled her heart. Somehow I doubt that. Heaven help her, she was crushing hard. All in one day. All in a man who'd had to coerce her into going out with him in front of half the townsfolk. So, tell me what a day in the life of a ranch owner looks like. Sure, she was grasping for a topic change, but Marley genuinely wanted to know. Jason gave her a general outline of a typical spring day, which, he explained, was very different from a day in summer, winter, or fall, where ranch chores were concerned. He asked about her next, how she learned to gut the fish without cutting out excess meat, how old she'd been when she first learned. Along the way, he'd retrieved a plaid quilt and invited her to curl up with him on the patio swing by the fire.
You mentioned, he said after a quiet moment, that the folks at the Trout farm know about your mom. I know who she is, Rachel Starr, famous soap opera diva, but I got the impression I was missing something.
Marley leaned her head on Jason's arm, inhaling the scent of his heavenly cologne. She hadn't let herself get so comfortable around the opposite sex since she was old enough to date men versus boys. She tested the answer in her mind, and was surprised to find that she felt safe sharing it with him. If all you know about Rachel Starr is that she's the scandalous man-eater on The Wild and the Weary, then you're definitely missing something. Marley pinned the edge of the blanket between her finger and thumb, slid them along the silky edge as she thought back on the person her mother used to be. She and my dad hit it off at a mutual friend's wedding in California. She'd already changed her last name to Starr, used to be Connolly. She'd been working as an extra on movie sets and stuff. She did a few commercials, too. In fact, she showed Britt and me this toothpaste commercial she shot years prior. I remembered being so proud. Anyway, Charlie said she quickly became enamored with the whole country life when she came out for a visit. She hadn't gotten the big breakthrough she always wanted, so she got a job out here helping with the chores at a bunkhouse, and after dating my dad for just 4 months, the two got married. Rachel said she was done with Hollywood, ready to settle down and have a family. Jason shifted a bit, closing the small gap between them. The weight and warmth of him felt amazing. Marley couldn't imagine how, after just one date, it felt natural to be so close. But it did. Close not only physically, but emotionally as well. Here she was opening up about a topic she rarely talked to anyone about. Yet, it felt like she'd been confiding in him for years. According to my dad, Rachel got a call from her agent while she was expecting me. A TV executive was offering her a lead in a daytime drama. Her dream job, basically. But they'd have to pick up and move to California, something my dad couldn't do. She talked about taking the job anyway and getting an apartment in L.A., but as soon as the producer caught wind that she was expecting, he took the offer off the table. She sighed, the feel of Jason so warm and close taking the sting out of the difficult memory. She never spoke another word about it, Marley said. Until Lily was 4 years old, Britt was 6, I was 8. It was like a switch. One day she was here playing devoted wife and mother to 3, and the next, she was packing up, telling my dad how much she resented him and the girls for entrapping her in a life she didn't want. And then she left. The fire crackled louder in the absence of her words.
Wow, Jason said. No wonder you were leery about me.
Marley shot him a surprised look.
Or am I wrong? He asked.
No, she said. You're right. I guess I just see this woman who'd come from a life of fame, or at least aspirations for it. She came, she tried the country life, and she left us all behind. We found out later that she'd been in touch with The Wild and the Weary's producer, Stan Watley, who later married her, by the way. I guess Stan had already promised her the job. Marley shrugged, glad she'd been able to gloss over the story without sinking in, like an ice skater on a frozen lake. Stay on the surface and avoid the stabbing pain of its frigid depths, but break through, and the darkness would penetrate, achingly, thorough, and bone deep. "I'm sorry," Jason said in a whisper. "I can't imagine how a parent could leave their kids behind like that. It's against nature." The comment surprised her, too. Jason must have sensed it on her face because his brown eyes widened. "Sorry if that's offensive," he said. I mean, if you still feel a sense of loyalty." He died off there and gulped. She didn't, but she couldn't exactly form the simple words. All she could think of was the fact that Jason was kind enough to worry about even that. She'd always felt that men were often oblivious to the tender needs and hurts of others. But Jason was proving her wrong. He was attentive, considerate, and seemed to be very aware of the sort of damage her mother might have caused. "Where did you come from?" Marley blurted, only halfway meaning to ask. Jason tipped his head to one side and inspected her, a mix of amusement and curiosity playing over his face. A tug pulled at her heart then, subtle but certain, as something began to occur to her. Slowly, the realization trickled in as she turned into the rhythm of Jason's steady breath, the hypnotizing rise and fall of his chest. She wasn't the bull trout anymore, because try as she might to deny it, Marley had been snared by none other than Jason Keller. She pulled away, just enough to take in the expression on his face, and recognize the wild thrashing of her heart, trying in vain to resist the pull, knowing already that it was too late. Jason Keller had caught her fair and square, and now she was simply along for the ride. A trace of heat moved into her cheeks at the thought. Could he see it on her face? Jason's expression grew serious as he held her gaze. Slowly then, tentatively, he brought a hand to her cheek, traced the tips of his fingers along her jaw, and then down the side of her neck. Marley's heart hammered out an extra beat. She sighed out a shaky breath and tuned into the soft caress of his fingertips. Across her collarbone, then back up the side of her neck, behind her ear. So good. "I really like you, Marley," he rasped. She only nodded, too hypnotized by the bliss of his touch. His gaze dropped to her mouth, causing an entirely new thrill to spike through her. "Yes, please, Jason, kiss me." He lowered his head as if she'd spoken it aloud, stopping once he was a breath's space away. The sensation of his lips so close, his heated breath grazing her mouth as he sighed, all of it nearly set her skin ablaze. Was he testing her? Giving her a chance to back out? Or perhaps he simply knew the moment of anticipation would make it even sweeter. At last he came in, pressed his full, wonderful lips to hers in a slow, lingering kiss. Yes. Marley wrapped her arms around him, exploring the warmth of his neck, the contours of his shoulders, and the exquisite balance of push and pull as he kissed her in succession. Bliss. There was no better word for the experience. She tipped her head, let out a small sigh of pleasure, and assured herself she'd stop things in just a few seconds. After all, Marley had never been one to kiss on the first date, and here she was, not even at the standard porch step goodbye, and already she was wrapped in Jason's arms and enjoying the best kiss of her life. May as well take advantage of the moment. It wasn't like it could last. The thought, scissors sharp as it was, sliced through her euphoria in a blink. She hadn't meant to think it, but Marley could hardly ignore the truth. She knew herself all too well. She was the bull trout, the one that refused to get caught. The reminder sank into her conscious thoughts like a heavy stone. Regretting the action already, Marley brought things to an end with one last kiss. But she wasn't ready to let go of Jason Keller just yet, of this new, delicious hope she'd found in just 540 minutes with him. She rested her cheek against his, willing his handsome, spicy scent to memory, the feel of his short scruff on her skin. Sure, she was seeing things differently now while in the muscular arms of Jason Keller. But Marley would fall back into her stubborn mindset by morning. She knew it.
Uh-oh. Hear that buzzing? Jason asked softly. That's my alarm.
He pulled back enough to shoot her a heartbreaking smile. Don't forget this, Marley. It's real, it's wonderful, and you want it. You secretly really do. Jason snatched his phone off the seat and tapped the screen until it stopped buzzing.
I did promise to get you home on time. Guess that means we'd better leave now.
Oh? She squeaked. You're right. I don't want to be late.
Lie.
If she had it her way, Marley would stay tucked in Jason's embrace for the next hour and make up for all the kissing she'd missed out on over the years. She was entitled to that, right? Especially since she knew how impossible it would be for her to get sucked into another moment like this. Even with the charming cowboy who was proving to be more magnificent than she could have imagined. Knots of anxiety prodded deep in her gut as Jason helped her climb back into his truck. Marley stretched the seatbelt over her chest and fastened the buckle with a final sounding click. It wasn't warm out by any means, but the spring night suddenly felt downright cold now that she wasn't cuddling into him, especially as she considered that it would probably never happen again.
What are you thinking over there? Jason asked as he pulled onto the road. You're awfully quiet. Peyton always warned me that when a woman is quiet on the outside, there's a whole lot of talking happening on the inside.
Marley glanced over and gave in to a smile. Your sister's smart.
So?
He took one hand off the wheel and stretched it across the center console.
You gonna tell me what kind of talk is happening in there right now?
A dart of heat sunk into her chest as Marley glanced down at his hand. She slipped her palm over his and laced their fingers together. It was an intimate act, one probably more fit for official couples, but the gesture didn't feel out of place. In fact, it felt perfect. If only it could last. I'm just thinking about how... The bull trout inside her fought to use its voice, but Marley wasn't ready to let it take over just yet. I don't know.
Uh-oh, he said with a groan. It's my hair, huh? You hate my hair. It didn't pass the test.
She gave in to a half smile. No, I like your hair. A lot.
Good, he said, because I like you a lot. I'd like to get to know you.
That sentiment begged a response, a truthful one. Her heart thundered a rapid stream of painful protesting pumps. Here's the thing, she said. I wasn't kidding when I said I don't mind being alone. In fact, I've made up my mind so completely that even though I really like you, and I'd love to go out with you again.
That's great, Jason interjected. That's what I want too.
Yeah, but the problem is, I won't feel this way in the morning. See, when I wake up tomorrow, all these emotions I'm feeling will be gone. And I'll be right back in my don't want a guy state of mind and convinced that what I felt tonight wasn't even real. Her words seeped into the leather seats as she spoke, leaving nothing but the white noise of rubber tires on tar. Well, At least she'd gotten that out of the way. Now Jason knew that a relationship with Marley Jenkins was impossible, and she'd probably come off just crazy enough that he wouldn't care anymore. Whatever mystique she'd acquired by eluding him all this time had surely worn off, and now he could find someone normal to pursue. Another much deeper ache wiggled into that low corner of her heart. She wondered if the bull trout ever got lonely too, watching all of his friends leave the pond one by one. Jason slid a thumb over the back of her knuckles.
But what if you don't?
She turned back to look at him, the cool gray light from the dashboard illuminating his face. Huh?
You said you'd wake up and all your feelings for me would be gone, meaning you do actually have feelings for me. So, what if they're still there?
If only that were possible. She'd had many crushes since Charlie's diagnosis, but only fleeting ones. The bullheaded part of her was too stubborn to fall in love. They won't be. He chuckled under his breath.
So sure, are you?
Sadly, yes. It's not what I want. It's just what I know. He nodded.
Okay.
Okay. The white noise from their drive picked up again. That was it, huh? That was weird. Why did she have to be so weird? She blew out a pursed breath and turned to look out the window once more. Not that there was anything to see, just a reflection of Jason as he gripped the wheel with one hand. Marley used her free hand to tug the tangerine lip balm from her pocket and smooth it over her lips. She inhaled the scent as she considered the conversation once more. So, he'd given up on her then. That was for the best. When she got to her room tonight, Marley would have a good cry over the loss of what might have been, and then she'd fall asleep, only to wake up and realize that her feelings for him were gone, along with this silly new Marley who was just as enamored with Jason as the rest of the universe. Probably more so, because she'd seen the real him, and that's who she'd fallen for.
You won't dodge me anymore at the fish farm, will you?
Jason rubbed his thumb over her hand once more. No, she promised. I won't.
And let's just say that we remain friends. Friends are good to have, right?
Her heart did a leap in her chest. Geez, he was persistent. Right.
Well, let's say that you and I see each other from time to time as friends, and the feelings, the ones that'll vanish by morning, come back. Will you give me another chance?
She considered that. I'd probably be too proud to tell you they were back. She was only half kidding, but admitting it made her anxious for his reply.
Then how about we use a code word? Or code action? Like, let's say we're spending time together just as friends, and suddenly you're thinking of me as more than a friend. You could give my hand 2 fast squeezes.
He demonstrated by squeezing her hand.
1, 2. Just like that.
Oh, 'cause if we're hanging out as friends, we'll already be holding hands? She asked through a grin. He shot her a disapproving look.
Of course.
Marley shook her head. Fine. If all of those scenarios magically line up as you suggest, I'll do what you said. The look of triumph on Jason's face was priceless. It stayed in place as he pulled into her narrow drive, helped her out of the truck, and walked her up to the porch. A wayward glance at a crack in the blinds said her sisters were watching from the front room window, of course. With the dark sky at his back, the illumination over his face, Jason Keller looked like an angel. A very gorgeous angel. The hickory scent from their fire blended with his heavenly cologne, reminding her of the moments they'd shared by the fire. Jason fixed his brown eyes on hers.
So, are we already in just friend mode, or does that wait until the morning?
How was it that he could spark a fire in her chest with just a simple question alone? Marley rubbed her lips together as she considered. If things went how she figured they would, this would probably be her last chance to kiss him. "Yes," she whispered. "I mean, that won't happen until morning." The look on his face turned serious then, brooding almost, as he wrapped one solid hand around her hip and squeezed. Whoa. The fire moved, settling low in her tummy. At last, Jason lowered his head, tipped it just enough to come in for one soft, teasing kiss. "Good night, Marley," he whispered against her mouth. Her lids fluttered open. "Good night?" she squeaked. But it sounded more like a question, since she was nowhere near done kissing him yet. Jason straightened then, and placed the hat back on his head. "Thank you for going out with me today." He pulled the door wide open for her. "I had a wonderful time." "I did too," she whispered with a nod. Crickets chirped. A lone coyote howled in the distance, as if it, too, knew this would be her last taste of romance. Marley pushed past the ache in her heart and forced out a farewell. "Thank you again." She shuffled forward, one foot after the next. She was halfway inside the house when Jason spoke up one last time. "Oh, and Marley? Friends usually have one another's phone number. Mind if I get yours?" "Lord, thank you for sending someone persistent." "Sure." She recited the number for him while a celebration parade marched up and down her chest. The sound of barely stifled squeals from inside said Britt and Lily were celebrating too. A lazy grin pulled at one side of Jason's kissable lips. "Great," he said. "See you later." "See you later." Marley watched him for a bit, not wanting to step inside just yet. Not wanting to turn back into the woman she'd been before their date. She had the sudden urge to holler at him from across the yard. Tell him that if he gets turned down in a day or two, it would be that woman who did it. Not the one standing on the porch watching him leave. Not the one who ran her fingers through his hair. And definitely not the one who sank into the bliss of his kiss and felt it all the way to her toes. Please, Lord, don't let this new woman vanish come morning. Chapter 6. Two things were clear to Jason after his anticipated date. First, he was crazy about Marley Jenkins. Second, she liked him in return. As fleeting as she promised those feelings would be, Jason was determined to put them to the test. With the citrus flavor of her magnetic kiss still lingering on his lips, he hurried inside, leaned against the couch, and tugged his phone from his pocket. Earlier, Marley had told him that her father sold the only 2 horses they had while her dad was in treatment. When he asked if she missed riding, she'd admitted that she did. She missed it very much. Perfect. He typed out a quick text and read it over with a smile on his face. "You know what friends like to do together? Plant gardens. Mind if I come help you tomorrow after service? Maybe we can take the horses out when we're through." Might as well get her roped into another date before dawn crept in. He hit send, tucked the phone into his pocket once more, and cleaned up the patio while Jepson neighed beyond the corral. Gypsy joined in too. "I know," he assured them, hollering so his voice would carry. "You're sore at me for not riding you today. I'm sorry. I'll make up for it tomorrow, hopefully." With a stack of tins in one hand and a pile of empty takeout boxes in the other, Jason made his way back inside. He hooked his elbow on the door handle and used it to slide the thing closed behind him. He dropped the boxes in the waste bin and shuffled over to the sink. Thoughts of Marley on his mind. Her laugh. Dang, how it tugged at his insides. So much he felt it might turn him inside out. She was funny, too. And honest. To a fault, some might say. But at least he'd always know where she stood. Getting along with his family, and Jason did consider the Bransons to be his second family, was important to him. Seeing Marley joke around with Bob, laugh with Luke and Taylor, and give Mel and Pete rare inside tips about snaring the biggest, most elusive fish in the bunch. All of it had lit some sort of fire in him. She was all he could have hoped for in that department, and more. He hadn't expected to explore the romantic side of things just yet, but the sparks had been fire-hot and impossible to resist. Dang, he'd enjoyed her kiss. Made all the sweeter by the taste of triumph. Marley wasn't just playing hard to get. Seemed the woman was, in truth, closer to impossible where love was concerned. But she'd given him a chance, just as she'd promised, and boy, had it paid off. It had taken a whole lot of discipline to stop kissing that pretty mouth of hers at the doorstep, but he was a firm believer in taking things slowly. Besides, it wouldn't hurt to leave her wanting more. Just as he set the tins into the sink, Jason's phone let out a buzz. His heart raced into new speeds as he tugged it from his pocket once more. His eyes shot to the one word she'd responded with. It felt as if that fire, the one he'd put out before taking Marley home, had sparked back into full flame right inside his chest. Yes! He cheered, throwing a fist into the air. He looked down at the screen once more, enjoying the look of those 4 small letters and the wonderful word they made. Sure. Tomorrow it is, then. He recalled the time he'd gone to the amusement park with Peyton years ago. They climbed onto a coaster that Jason had been dying to go on. Till he was strapped in and the thing took off at rocket speed. He'd encountered a shot of terror in those brief moments. A thrill mingled with fear of the unknown jerks and turns that awaited him. One thing was clear where Marley was concerned. This was sure to be one heck of a ride. Chapter 7. Marley's eyes shot open to the sound of her alarm. She stared at her ceiling in the cool gray light and rested a hand over her heart. She'd keep it there just in case. If her feelings for him had vanished, there'd be a giant hole in their place. Okay, Marley. Time for the moment of truth. Jason Keller. The very name caused a flare of heat to jump through her chest. Yes, 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 yes. She still liked him. She liked him. And he liked her too. Hope swelled within her like a life force of its own, something that might sustain her as well as any feast. And feast on it she did. The whole time Marley was getting ready, she allowed herself to play the part of a crushing teenager. She'd hoped to see him at Sunday service, but it seemed he was still respecting that whole don't chase her away from God rule of his. Britt and Lily stayed after for the single adult social, which left Marley with the place all to herself. Perfect. She stepped into Dad's old pair of denim coveralls, as she did every year while planting the spring garden. The oversized pair was covered in grease stains, but she loved them just the same. After pulling her hair back, Marley tied a bandana around her ponytail and brushed on some blush. She gave herself a glance over in the mirror and noticed Dad's old notebook tucked in the big front pocket. Marley had forgotten all about it. What had started off as a few of Dad's musings in a notebook had turned out to be a journal she'd started to use to talk with her dad, tell him about what was new in her life. She'd missed it. Tonight, she told herself as she set it on Dad's old dresser. She'd fill him in on everything after she and Jason spent another amazing day together. Already she couldn't wait. When a knock came to the door, it took everything in Marley to hold in a squeal. She did, however, skip all the way to the door. "Hi there," she said with a growing grin. Jason looked her up and down. "Dang, you look cute." She giggled, loving the compliment. "So do you." That was no joke. He had his cowboy hat and jeans on today, this time with a tight t-shirt that showed off the contours of his muscled chest. "Shall we?" Jason asked. "Yep, we can go through the house." Marley motioned him inside. Once she had the door closed, she reached out, took hold of his hand, and led him through the kitchen. "You weren't at the 11 o'clock service today," she said, glancing over her shoulder at him. He locked eyes with her, seeming to search her face for a blink.
That's because I wasn't sure how you were going to feel when you woke up, remember?
Oh, that. Marley couldn't believe she'd actually shared that with him. Well, it was different this time.
Oh, yeah? He asked in a sing-song voice.
She nodded, knowing he'd need more of an answer than that. But it was too awkward to talk about. Besides, she didn't want to jinx it. But then a recollection came to her, and she knew just how she'd let him know. Marley softened her grip on his hand as they approached the sliding glass door. And then, quickly, so he wouldn't mistake it, she gave it 2 squeezes. Jason chuckled under his breath.
I was hoping you'd say that.
He leaned in then, pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, and spoke against her skin.
I feel the same way.
Dear Dad, you'll be so glad to hear that I'm no longer the bull trout. I finally let myself fall for someone. And guess what? It's been 10 whole days and my feelings for him are only getting stronger. He helped plant the garden last week. He did all the tilling, and he even complimented your coveralls. We rode horses after that until sunset. Jepson and Gypsy. It was one of the most beautiful nights of my whole life. We've gone riding almost every night since then, too. Oh my gosh, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually falling in love. I think you'd like him, too. He comes from Los Angeles, but he's a total cowboy at heart. He's not like Mom at all. When we're together, I can't stop smiling. He jokes with me about my obsession with making my own lip balm, and insists on sampling each flavor, which can only be done lip to lip. But don't worry, he's been a total gentleman so far. Am I crazy for letting myself fall for him so fast? Britt and Lily are thrilled about it, as you can imagine. And I am too. Mostly. But there's just one thing I worry about. It's actually hard to even write about. It's just that a part of me does still worry. Just a little bit. That something will lure him back to Los Angeles. That he'll leave me the way Mom left us. It's almost like that bull trout is still inside somewhere, looking for a way to free itself. I'm sure if you were here, you'd have the perfect advice for me. You always knew how to slip your words of wisdom into any situation. Tears ran off Marley's cheek as she finished the thought. I miss you so much. It hurts. I wish I could go back in time just for one night and spend the evening with you. We'd watch that Western TV series you'd love. I'd make your favorite. Garlic bread, Caesar salad, and lasagna with cheddar, not mozzarella. Britt would make those cookies you liked. The no-bake ones. And Lily, well, Lily would set the table. Marley gave in to a laugh as more tears came. She closed the book, pulled it to her chest, and gave in to another round of sobs. I miss you, Dad, she said. I feel like I'm gonna mess this up and blow it with him. Don't let me do that, okay? She reached over, flicked off her lamp, and stared into the darkness for a blink before closing her eyes. Things had been perfect with Jason. So much that she couldn't help but fear something might ruin it, even if that something was herself. No, don't think that way. She'd gotten past all that, and just in time, too. Now she could really invest in the man of her dreams. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, Marley found herself uttering the words once more. Please don't let me mess things up with him. Chapter 8. The last sliver of sun had sunk into the horizon, leaving the small group in the cool glow of twilight. So, let's do a little recap, Marley said, tucking her lip balm back into her pocket. She eyed Peyton and Luke. I now know about Jason's passion for flossing his teeth. Obsession is more like it, Peyton chimed. 10 minutes a night. Marley laughed. And then the flossing session is often followed by a rummage through the kitchen for a late-night snack. Jason covered his face with one hand.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, Luke said. When Peyton was staying there and she and I were getting acquainted, we had to wait for the bedtime routine before a hook-up by the fireplace. Felt like hours. The two chuckled, and Peyton moved in to plant a kiss to Luke's cheek. Gunnar had fallen asleep in Lily's arms before dinner was even through, which explained why her youngest sister kept so quiet at the end of the table. The gathering wasn't quite like the ones thrown by the Bransons, but it had still been a wonderful evening just the same. Peyton and Luke hadn't been the only ones dishing the dirt on Jason. Taylor offered a few goodies as well. One about Jason's obsession with the lucky belt he wore for every rodeo. Lily and Britt were eager to share what they had on Marley, too. Their main focus centered on her obsession with lip balm. You should see how many nooks and crevices she sneaks them into, Britt said with wide eyes. By the couch, in the kitchen, at the bathroom sink, in the study, by her bed, even in the car. Jason had come to her rescue, though, muttering something like, So that's why she always tastes so good. It had been a fun evening for sure, and as summer approached, there was sure to be a whole lot more, if all went well. And there it was, that doubting voice in the back of her head, the one that tried to worm its way into every beautiful occasion. Oh, Jason, Peyton said, pulling Marley from her musings. Dad was asking about the gala. He says you haven't committed to it yet. Why not? Marley glanced over in time to see Jason shrug. Gala? She asked, looking from him back to his sister. The Kellers host a massive gala dinner each year to raise funds for Operation Smile. My dad and a bunch of other plastic surgeons fly overseas and operate on babies who'd never stand a chance at getting the surgery otherwise. That's amazing, Marley said. And Jason has gone with me the last few years to help out, Peyton added. Marley set her gaze back on Jason. He lifted his chin, a thoughtful look in his eye. Wasn't sure how you'd feel about me going back to L.A. for that, especially with... He stopped there and shrugged again. With everything that happened with her mom? Is that what he was going to say? The idea stung. Of course I wouldn't want you to miss something like that, Jason. Would you come with me? He asked it like the question had already been poised on his tongue. Yeah, Peyton said. That's a great idea. You'd love it, Marley. Tons of food, a bunch of Hollywood's elite gathered in one place. The idea planted a lump of fear deep in her chest. It sounded more like the last place on earth she'd want to go. The Hollywood crowd doesn't exactly appeal to her, Jason explained. Guilt welled up in her gut. I don't want you to miss it, she said. And I don't want to go without you. The background chatter between Britt and Taylor died down. A chorus of crickets picked up in its place. This was definitely not the time to have a conversation like this, in front of a small crowd, family or not. We better get Gunnar home, Peyton said. Luke came to a stand. Right, he said. Little stinker will want to eat once more before he hits the sack. Must get that from his Uncle J.J., he razzed. Marley saw her guests out, trying her best to offer normal glad you came and thanks for the fun night greetings along the way. But her mind was stuck someplace else. Visions of champagne glasses clanking over a sea of evening gowns, tuxedos, and flashing bulbs. The very crowd that lured her mom away from them. Why don't you and Jason go out on the hammock? Britt suggested as their company drove away. Lily and I can clean up the dinner mess, okay? Yeah, Lily agreed. We'll clean up. Bless Britt and Lily. They'd obviously picked up on the unsettled tension in the air. The far corner of their property hosted a small forest of trees. The Jenkins girls had hung several hammocks throughout the wooded property once spring began. It was the perfect place to enjoy a cup of morning coffee before the sun moved overhead enough for the branches to block it out. And now, as dry pine needles crunched beneath the soles of her boots, Marla couldn't help but think the light of their relationship was being threatened as well. blocked out by the Hollywood-sized elephant from her past. It took a while to settle into the hammock side by side. But once they were lying comfortably in place, the fabric nearly closing around them like a cocoon, Jason nuzzled his face into her hair and sighed. "I don't want this to trigger you." She didn't want it to either, but it already had. The aching thuds in her chest said it all, not to mention the growing feeling in her gut that things between her and Jason couldn't possibly last. She clenched her eyes shut, fought the quiver of her lip as her fears shot from her heart to her lips. "I'm scared you won't want to come back after." "I know," he whispered, "but that won't happen. Ever." She nodded, wanting very badly to believe it. Jason found her hand, wove his fingers through hers, and sighed. "Listen, this has been the best 2 weeks of my life. I know what I want, and I know what I don't want. I don't have to do this event. I'm not even planning on it. I just wish Peyton hadn't brought it up." Marley remembered Gerald Tanner's baby, the one who'd been born with a severe cleft palate. The surgery had been life-altering. This was a good cause, and she didn't want to interfere in any way. Heaven knew if Jason could charm Marley out of her determined mindset to fly solo the rest of her life, he could charm thousands of dollars from the Hollywood starlets at the event with that dimple alone. The dread that had crept in lifted a bit. In fact, what had felt destined for an onslaught of outright despair only moments ago was beginning to fade. A flicker of hope sparked up next, mingled with a new flare of determination. Marley had only enjoyed a taste of what being in love could be like, and she wasn't about to let it slip away so easily. "When is it?" she asked. "The banquet." Jason shifted in the hammock. "It doesn't matter, I'm not going." "I want you to," Marley said. "And if the invitation still stands, I'd like to come." It felt good to say it aloud. In fact, as Jason responded with things like, "That would be awesome, and are you sure about this?" Marley's level of certainty only grew. Yes, this was the right thing to do, and things would be just fine. It wasn't until she pressed her lips against Jason's in a celebratory kiss that a wave of misgiving washed over her. "You're going to regret it," the inner voice warned. "This just might be how you lose him." Perhaps that was true, but Marley didn't want to live the rest of her life in fear. If she was destined to lose Jason to his old life, it'd be far better to have it happen now. She only hoped that this time, the voice of doubt was wrong. Chapter 9. Jason eyed his reflection in the hotel mirror. It had been a long time since he'd donned a tuxedo, and he couldn't say he missed it. He wondered how Marley was doing on the other side of that door. He'd rented 2 rooms for the night, though he hoped they'd spend a decent amount of time cuddling on the sofa after tonight's event before parting ways. A quick glance at his watch said it was time to head out. The limo would be there soon. He shot one last look at his reflection. He imagined what it might be like if he'd never broken free and pursued the life he'd always dreamed of. Would he be attending this party with a heart toward the kids they'd be helping? Or with aspirations for reaching new levels of fame? Or would he simply be plowing along like a neglected workhorse, miserably chugging along, doing whatever it took to keep up the family image? He turned his attention to the door that separated his room from Marley's. 3 long strides took him close enough to knock, something he'd do once he calmed the sudden racing in his heart. The fact was, the evening could be another trigger for Marley. The last thing he wanted is for doubts to creep back into that overactive mind of hers. He straightened his arms to his sides, tugged on the sleeves of his coat, and let out a slow-paced breath. Time to see how this would play out. Marley could hardly believe her eyes. The woman staring back at her from the fancy hotel mirror looked a lot like the one and only Rachel Starr. The pearl-colored gown Peyton helped her pick out accented every curve Marley had. The gorgeous, glittering piece made her look taller and bustier and like a totally different person. "I don't know if I can do this," she muttered under her breath. She smoothed a hand down the front of the gown and straightened her shoulders. Poised, Marley. Don't slouch. Wow. She looked even more like Mom with the correct posture. But as she stepped closer to the mirror in her matching stiletto heels, the resemblance started to fade. Marley looked more like herself, a woman who, if she were honest, she'd grown to like over the years. Her mother might have rejected her, but Marley had a whole lot of people who loved and cared about her. She had Jason now, too. The two hadn't exactly used the L word just yet. Heck, they'd only been dating for 6 weeks. But she'd known weeks ago that she was in love with him, which must have been why she'd agreed to come to this thing despite her aversion to it. A series of knocks sounded, and Marley glanced at the door leading to Jason's room. A knot of nerves twisted inside her gut. She'd adapted a don't ask questions she didn't want the answers to policy where the evening was involved. If she weren't afraid of the answers, she might ask all sorts of things. Will the press be there? Will they snap pictures of us together? Would the picture end up in some magazine with a cruel title about the Keller Cowboy settling for a country bumpkin? A new zing of nerves tingled up the back of her neck as she grasped the lever to unlock the latch. A quick twist here, the turn of the knob there, and soon she was prying open the heavy oak door. Whoa. Marley had been so distracted by the thoughts in her head that she hadn't thought to prepare herself for what she might see on the other side of the door. Jason blew out a whistle and tipped his head to eye her up and down. Thank you, Lord in heaven, for this moment. Marley released a shallow laugh in response. Ditto. She ran her gaze up his tall, magnificent frame, over those broad, angular shoulders, and up to that gorgeous face with the chiseled jaw and perfect grin. If he wanted to, Jason could make a living off his ridiculously out-of-proportion good looks. He extended an arm, turned his hand face up, and lifted a brow. Shall we? Marley rested her hand in his. We shall. He led her to the limo next, and soon they were passing high-rises in the most crowded parts of Los Angeles. Can't believe you used to live here, she said. Jason kept his eyes pasted on her. Neither can I. She was glad they had brunch plans with Jason's parents and step-parents in the morning. It'd give her a chance to see the home he grew up in, since his mother had remained there after the divorce. And of course, spend time getting to know each of them too, since tonight they'd be busy mingling. A Spanish-style mansion with white brick and a red roof housed the event. Bold spotlights shone on a row of tall palm trees leading to a magnificent staircase. More floodlights illuminated the massive structure, causing it to glow against the dark night sky. Beyond the enormous windows, glowing chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, promising it would be just as grand on the inside. A crowd of camera-carting paparazzi swarmed a man exiting one of those Hummer limos a few yards ahead. A tinted window separated them from their driver. Jason tapped it down an inch. Jack, we'd like a few minutes before we exit if you don't mind. Not at all, the man said. Jason rolled the window up once more and shifted in his seat to face her. A fresh round of nervous energy bubbled in Marley's tummy. Jason gave her hand a squeeze. You nervous? She took in the kind concern she saw in those warm brown eyes and smiled. Course not. She laughed. I mean, unless that shaky sound in my voice means I'm nervous. Or my hands, do they feel clammy to you? And I think my heart stopped beating somewhere a few miles back. Should we be concerned about that? Let me take a look. I did take some medical courses, you know. Jason brought a hand to her neck, traced the tips of his fingers down the delicate slope, and licked his lips. The furrow of his brow said he was focused in on her now, and that intense gaze was nearly as affecting as his touch. He tipped his head to one side, brought his lips to the spot just beneath her earlobe, and kissed her there. He moved down an inch and kissed again. And then again. The next kiss he planted was longer, slower, and enhanced by the gentle caress of his tongue. Goosebumps rippled over her arms. Oh, I can feel your pulse right here, he crooned. It's going pretty fast, actually. Yeah, thanks to him. The damp heat of his breath caused an entirely new thrill to rise in her chest. Marley reached out, steadied herself by gripping his shoulders. Thank heavens they were sitting down. Her knees would have buckled beneath her at the bliss. Jason pressed kisses along her jaw next, pausing when he made it to one corner of her lips. Slowly then, he traced the shape of her mouth with the gentle caress of his bottom lip. His heated breath only adding to the spell. And then all at once, he stilled. His movement, his breath, everything seemed to halt, until she heard his next breath come at last, this one shaky, like hers. She sensed he had something to say, yet she couldn't imagine what it might be. He nodded subtly, then absently, as if he'd set his mind to whatever it was he was contemplating. And then it came. "I love you, Marley," he mumbled against her skin. If her heart had actually stopped a few miles back, it was making up for the missed beats now, pumping in excess as she tipped back to meet his gaze. Wave after glorious wave of warmth pulsed through her body. Jason loved her. And what a wonderful thing that was, because she felt the very same way. She tipped back, took in the passion she saw in his brown eyes, and dared herself to speak. "I love you too," she whispered. Marley had waited her whole life for this moment. She just hadn't known it until then. That dimple sank into Jason's cheek again. At once, he came in for another kiss, a celebration of the words they'd just shared, the confirmation that their tender love was in fact mutual, and real, and growing every day. This time Jason skipped the gentle build-up, the series of kisses that led to a deeper exchange, and started with a sense of passion she hadn't known in him yet. The urgent press and pull of his mouth coaxing her into new levels of surrender. She melted into him, releasing a sigh of pleasure from low in her throat. Yes, so good. She belonged to Jason Keller, and she wanted nothing more. Suddenly bulbs flashed from the other side of the tinted glass, causing a moment of awareness to strike. Still in a daze, Marley willed herself to break from the kiss and speak. "What was that?" she mumbled. "Just a paparazzi," he said before kissing her again. "They can't see us through the tinted glass," he explained between kisses. "They just don't want to miss anything." "Right," she said before giving in to one last kiss. She sighed, reminding herself of their shared affirmations of love, enjoying the fact that they had their whole lives to explore where it might lead. But tonight they had a job to do. "We better get in there." Jason groaned, tipped his head to catch her gaze once more, and gave her a brooding expression. "I can't tell you how badly I want to stay in here with you and blow off this event." She grinned. "Me too." Jason cleared his throat, reached for the lever on the console, and lowered the window that separated them from their driver. "Okay, Jack," he said. Jack climbed out of the limo while Marley refreshed her lip gloss and tucked the small purse back under her arm. Jason straightened the collar of his suit coat and took hold of Marley's hand. "You ready?" Sure, she might have to deal with a few triggers among Hollywood's elite, but it was for a good cause. And she'd have the man she loved right by her side. It was time to make some money for those children. With that, Marley gave Jason's hand 2 squeezes. "Ready?" Chapter 10. Jason sank into a leather lounge chair and fixed his gaze on the glorious woman standing behind the donations desk. Marlee Jenkins had set it back. She loved him. A massive celebration broke out in his chest, the chambers of his heart ringing out like wedding bells in a chapel. If he were honest, that's exactly where he hoped they were headed. He wanted nothing more than to spend a lifetime with the Montana woman who'd captured his heart, and it seemed heaven's stars were aligning in his favor. A smile crossed his lips as he watched the engaging manner in which Marley spoke with the A-listers attending the party. She didn't intimidate easily, that was obvious, and Jason found that incredibly sexy. It proved all the more that she was the perfect woman for him, one not influenced by status or stardom. He watched as she tipped her head back in laughter in response to something said among the small crowd gathered around her. There she was, that same kind Montana Marley no matter the circumstance. Forget the fact that she had deep wounds connected to the lifestyle led by her present company. She wasn't letting that stop her from being the generous woman he knew her to be. A new flood of heat pooled into his chest. He hadn't been kidding when he thanked the Lord upon laying eyes on Marley earlier. In that moment, Jason envisioned lifting the cowboy hat off his head, dropping to his knees, and offering the most sincere praise to his maker. Marley truly was a gift, and he would do anything it took to do right by her. A quick glance at the clock said they had more than an hour to go. In a moment, Jason would force himself to get back up and mingle. He couldn't help but dread it. He'd been back in LA for a total of 9 hours and already he was homesick. Bob Branson had a favorite saying, "Your soul just knows when you're home." Likewise, Jason's soul knew when he was away from home. As earnest as a few dozen of the attendees were, a heavy sense of arrogance and selfishness hung in the air. For many, it was about what the social gathering could do for them. Ah, well, at least they'd open their pocketbooks while they were there. Children from across the world would benefit from it, and that's what mattered. Just then, a woman across the way caught his eye. She was beautiful, no doubt, but that's not what got his attention. There was something familiar in the almond shape of her eyes and the high set of her cheekbones. The middle-aged woman looked like an older version of Marley. Dread punched him so hard it made his gut clench. Rachel Starr had come, and if he wasn't mistaken, she seemed to be heading Marley's way. A curse fell off his lips as he shot to his feet. He eyed the crowds that separated Marley from her mother. A cluster of tuxedos here, a mass of evening gowns there, and then it was Marley, standing behind the tall donation booth, that wide grin weaving spells over one of the biggest Hollywood names there. It would be foolish of Rachel Starr to shine a light on the ugly truth of her past by addressing Marley in such a public place. But what if the woman were an opportunist? She'd risk it. Jason couldn't have that. Marley didn't need that sort of trigger reminding her of why she'd never wanted to give Jason a chance. He spun in place, looking for someone to replace Marley at the booth. Peyton, where are you?" Before he came around full circle, a hand cupped his shoulder. He glanced back to see his sister standing there. "Rachel Starr is here," Peyton said. "She says she wants to talk to you and Marley together?" Chapter 11.
"Well, it has been a pleasure speaking with you tonight, Marley from Montana," Kingston Connor said while taking Marley's hand. He pulled it to his lips and planted a kiss on it. "Had I known you were going to be assisting on the service trip, I'd have signed up to go along as well." Marley laughed, sandwiched the man's hand, and sighed. Sure, he was pushing his late 50s, but the actor was as handsome and charming as ever. "Well, I only just decided last week. Perhaps it's not too late for you to join as well." Morocco. Wow. What an adventure that would be. An eye-opening one. And Marley welcomed it. Welcomed the chance to do some hands-on service with the man she loved. The man who loved her in return. A fresh thrill floated through her as she thought back on the way he'd said it. It had been such a whirlwind evening, her mind being pulled in so many directions, that Marley kept reminding herself of the glorious moment she and Jason had shared in the limo. It was like discovering it was Christmas Day again and again. Her eyes wandered over the crowd,
Where had he gone, anyway?
Didn't know this was your daughter. Of course, that makes sense now that I see the two of you.
The words spoken by Kingston Connor barely started to register when Jason appeared by her side. His hand curved around her waist.
Peyton's going to take over for you, he mumbled into her ear. Come on.
She felt the anxious energy in his touch, sensed that he wanted to usher her off as quickly as possible. As soon as she caught sight of the woman behind Kingston, Marley realized why he was in such a hurry. Chestnut hair streaked with gold highlights, blue eyes that sparkled like the diamonds at her throat, and the billion-dollar smile she used so well. Rachel Starr. The blood in Marley's body turned to ice, rock hard and too frozen to move. "My Marley," Rachel chimed in a sing-song voice. "How wonderful to see you." Chapter 12. Marley traced a finger along the rim of her glass, her eyes glued to the action. "Patty Devereaux said you two were dating, which is why I told Stan we needed to come tonight, right, darling?"
"Right, dear."
Admiration rang thick in Stan Watley's tone. Marley could only imagine the way it beamed off the man's face. She just couldn't look at it for herself. It had been hard enough to agree to join the couple at the quiet table by the bar. If it weren't for Jason, she might not have agreed to it at all. She glanced over at Jason in time to catch the reassuring wink he often gave. It provided a measure of comfort to know he was by her side, to know just how very much he wanted to be in that place. You have him, Marley. No matter what happens with your mother right now, you have Jason, Lily, and Britt. That's all that matters. Marley sensed that Jason hoped she'd find a measure of closure during the soiree. He'd suggested as much while encouraging her to agree to it, but Marley wasn't so sure. It seemed more likely that she'd walk away from the meeting with an even deeper wound than before. "Not that we wouldn't have come anyway," Rachel rambled. "We love to give to charity, but it just happened to provide an opportunity for Stan and I to propose something we think might be of interest to you both." Marley forced her gaze back to Rachel. The woman's eyes bounced between Marley and Jason as a new, nervous energy filled the space. She was working up to something. Marley could feel it. "Go ahead," she finally urged. "What do you want to propose?" May as well cut to the chase. Marley braced herself by abandoning her glass and reaching for Jason's hand. "Stan, why don't you tell them?" Rachel crooned. Stan's goatee was peppered with gray, giving him that dignified appearance. And though his brown eyes seemed kind as he smiled at her, Marley sensed a shrewdness behind them.
"I've made Rachel co-producer of The Wild and the Weary, in case you haven't heard, and together, we'd like to offer Jason a role in the show."
"Not just a role," Rachel blurted over her husband. "It's the lead role. Like, you'll come onto the show in all your Keller Cowboy glory, and you'll be the Wild and the Weary's new main attraction. Your character will own a ranch of his own, just like you." If Marley's blood had turned to ice moments ago, the couple's offer was a heat wave, causing the blood to melt and flow so quickly she felt her heart might drown. She stared at her mother in the moment of horror, bitterness sharp on her tongue, and fought to put order to the words in her head. "I can't believe you're doing this," she blurted before she could stop herself. "It's not enough that you robbed me and the girls of a mom. Now you're trying to take the man I love away, too?"
"Marley,"
Jason mumbled, but Rachel was already rising to her feet. The woman sucked in a dramatic gasp. "I can't believe you'd suggest such a thing. Do you not know that we sent money to help support you girls over the years?" Stan was on his feet now, too, resting a hand on Rachel's back.
"It seems you've misunderstood our intentions," he said calmly.
He urged Rachel to sit down with a nod toward her seat. She did, and Stan lowered himself once more.
"You would come to California with him, of course, Marley. And your sisters, too. Your mother would like to be a part of your lives. That's what she's really trying to say. All of you could move out here."
Rachel sniffed and dabbed the tip of her reddened nose. Tears welled up in her eyes, causing them to catch and reflect light, the way they did while the cameras rolled. Fake. All of it. It was an act. Marley wanted to say so, to call them both liars, but Jason spoke up next.
"I do appreciate the offer," he said, "but I don't have any interest. I chose the life I have because I love it. More than that, I love this woman by my side. You've really missed out on having her in your life, and that's a darn shame."
He turned to Marley then, took her by the hand, and gave the couple a curt nod.
"Let's go, babe."
Marley followed Jason's lead in a daze. Before she even realized what was happening, they were back in the limo. It remained quiet on the way back to the hotel. Jason seemed to be digesting the situation as much as she was. Hopefully he wasn't regretting what he'd done by turning down the offer. The rational side of her said that was the last thing he was doing, and the wounded side of her couldn't help but worry. Perhaps the idea of playing a cowboy appealed to him. He could have the best of both worlds. There was another worry, too, this one attached to herself. Would this make the feelings go away? Would she wake up in the morning and realize that the old bull trout had taken the reins once more? She and Jason parted ways at the hotel to change out of their evening wear, then met up at the couch in his hotel room to watch a movie. Still, the fear hadn't faded. Jason ordered room service, chocolate-covered strawberries, and a basket of fresh, hot rolls with raspberry butter, which was thoughtful, but Marley couldn't help but think of how it reflected an entirely different life. "Please don't let my feelings for him die," she prayed inwardly. "Please help me stop freaking out." Things were fine. She was sure of it. She just needed to get through the night, get back to Montana, and put her mind toward the trip to Morocco, which was just 10 days away. The idea was enough to put that spark of hope back into her chest, a spark she rode on throughout the rest of the night. When morning came, Marley walked over to the window and threw open the hotel drapes. While eyeing the cityscape, complete with manicured storefronts, swaying palm trees, and sunshine to spare, Marley tested herself once more. Yes, she was still very much in love with Jason. A deep sigh passed through her lips. Thank heavens the old Marley hadn't made a comeback. She thought back on the evening as she got ready for the day, recalling the way Jason had championed her in front of Rachel's star. She replayed the incident once more as she rolled her carry-on toward the entryway of her hotel room. She was about to knock on the connecting door to Jason's room when an envelope slid onto the entry tile from the hallway exit. She glanced down at the cursive script penned onto the front. "Marley, please read." The fears she'd fought off throughout the night came back full force. Great. Just when she thought she'd survived the return of her mother, one more thing had to jump in her way. A new knot of nerves built in her chest as she snatched the letter off the ground. She wouldn't read it yet. She might not read it ever. What Marley would do was head home with Jason, prepare for the service trip to Morocco, and pray that her mother never bothered her or Jason again. Chapter 13. Dear Dad, we leave for Morocco tomorrow. I still haven't read Rachel's letter. I'm not exactly sure of what I'm afraid of. I hate that I'm letting her have some sort of power over me again, but I can't help it. I'm terrified that whatever it says could drown this new, able to love and be loved Marley, and the old me will be left in her place, a coward destined to be alone forever. Marley set her pen down and stared at the page, a new sort of determination bubbling within her. No, She wouldn't let her mother have that kind of power over her. She was going to read the dumb letter once and for all. As soon as she was done, she'd come back and tell Dad all about it. It was too late to call Jason and tell him, being that it was 1 a.m, but she'd tell him about it on the way to the airport. He'd be proud of her for reading it, and for putting it behind her once and for all. With that thought, Marley scooted toward the edge of her bed. Her travel bag rested there, reminding her that she'd be spending the next 26 days with Jason. It wouldn't be a vacation, but it'd be so very rewarding. The photos Jason showed her from prior years said it all. Stop delaying, Marley. Go get the letter and read it. A dart of determination sank all the way to her toes. I'm doing it, she said, shooting to her feet and running over to her dresser. In one quick jerk, she tore open the drawer. A dive beyond the pile of mismatched socks in the corner, and the edge of the letter grazed her fingertips. She snatched it into her grip and hurried back over to the bed. Quickly, Marley tore the envelope open and plucked out a folded piece of lined paper. Excitement and dread clashed within her as she unfolded the page. Handwritten. Oh man. This was actually her mom's handwriting. The same mom who used to sing Mother Goose rhymes with her before bed. She clenched her eyes shut as a flood of emotion gushed over her, but Marley forced herself to choke it back quick. She'd fantasized about what might be in here several times. An apology, perhaps? The few words about how she hoped that she and her sisters had a good life? She might tell Marley that she'd grown into a beautiful young woman, and that she could see that little girl inside somewhere. Of course, it was possible the words in this letter weren't kind or tender at all, which is why she'd waited 9 whole days to open it. With one last deep breath, Marley forced herself to read it. Marley, I regret that you and Jason did not see our offer for what it was. A chance for you and your sisters to get out of the dreaded life of running a trout farm. I think it's only fair that I, as your mother, warn you about the danger your future holds. Jason Keller and I are made of the same cloth, whether you want to admit it or not. And if you hold him back now, he might stay for a little while. He might even stay long enough to marry you and father a few kids. But sooner or later, the nag for his old life will prevail, and Jason will eventually give in. He'll leave you, and by then, trust me, he will resent you and whatever kids you have for holding him back. Don't say I never warned you. The note slipped from Marley's grip and onto the floor. She brought a hand to her mouth as a mounting rush of nausea rumbled through her. It was everything she did not want to hear, from the very woman she did not want to hear it from. Someone who knew firsthand what it was like to be Jason. Stop, Marley. They're not cut from the same cloth at all. They were complete opposites as far as Marley could tell, but that didn't do much to reverse the train of imminent damage from plunging ahead. Perhaps if she dived into the work in Morocco, Marley would forget all about the letter and the warning and the overwhelming jaws of dread that were crushing her like a massive vice. Jason will leave you. You'll be years into your marriage raising kids and living life and thinking everything's perfect and wonderful, and suddenly he'll up and leave you forever. The nausea rolled deeper, working its way up to her chest, through her throbbing heart. Already the new side of Marley was shriveling. She groaned, working to mentally fight it off. She wanted to hop off the bed, tear up the letter, and then set it ablaze in the backyard. Maybe she'd let the neighbor's dog pee on the ashes once she was done. But she couldn't get herself to move. Already the fear was having its way with her. It was inevitable, wasn't it? Yes. She avoided it this long, the heart-to-heart with her old self. Maybe old Marley wasn't so bad after all. Maybe she was just trying to protect her. Marley would find out soon enough. May as well face this war now and see who would come out on the other side. Chapter 14. Jason hoisted the travel bag onto his shoulder and walked through the kitchen, taking one last glance at the horses in the corral. Taylor had agreed to come stay at his place while he was gone. To keep Jepson and Gypsy from getting lonely, he'd even volunteered to bring a date over each weekend to ride with him, maybe even Britt. Jason glanced at the horseshoe clock to see that he was 40 minutes ahead of schedule, which meant he could go help Marley with any last-minute chores she had on her list. A short, high-pitched chirp broke into his thoughts. His phone. He yanked it from his back pocket and grinned when he saw it was Marley calling. He couldn't exactly explain it, but in the short second it took to bring the phone to his ear, a warning came to his mind. Jason ignored it.
"Howdy there, darling," he crooned. "I was just thinking about you."
The greeting was met with silence.
"Marley?"
His heart dropped in the quiet pause. She sniffed on the other end of the line.
"I can't go with you, Jason. I'm so sorry, but I just can't."
Sharp heat pricked his chest as he replayed the words in his head.
"Please, no."
His hand clenched into a tight, aching fist as a groan snuck up his throat. It had happened, hadn't it? She'd talked herself out of loving him. More sobs spilled through the line, seeming to confirm the fear. And just like that, the heat in his chest exploded, shooting flames through his body in a blink. He scrambled for something to blame. Anything.
"Your mother's letter,"
he blurted, remembering how he'd encouraged her to read it and put it behind her once and for all.
"Is that what this is about? What did she say?"
"That's not why."
"The heck it isn't, Marley. When did you read it?"
She sniffed again, then choked back a sob.
"Last night."
He could only guess at the sort of moronic message the woman had left her. But really, how long could Marley play the victim? She knew Jason well enough by now, she had to. So why would she let some stupid letter ruin everything? Rage gripped hold of him at the question, thick and heavy. Bloating and swelling, and begging him to pop off with things that would make Marley sorry she'd ever loved him at all.
"You did this to yourself. You were never going to be happy, were you? You were always going to be looking for an excuse to let me go, and now you think you've got one."
He clenched his jaw shut over the words trying to form.
"Help me, Lord. Give me the words, please."
Another second ticked on, and then another. This couldn't be happening. And what exactly was happening here anyway? Jason would go to Morocco, while Marley spent the 26 days erasing him from her memory. All so she could go back to ignoring him once he returned. Was that it? He punched a hard fist into the leather couch. This wasn't helping.
Think.
Marley was scared. He knew that much, but of what?
What are you afraid of, Marley? Because you look at this from my perspective, I could spend a lifetime in fear too. I mean, look at this logically. You've been the bigger threat all along. I've known you might walk away from me from our very first date. But I loved you anyway, because you're worth the risk.
No more, Jason. Leave it at that. He glanced up at the clock.
Listen, I'm familiar enough with the butterfly concept, letting it fly away and all that. I already know I love you. In fact, I'd like to spend the rest of my life with you. But if you don't feel the same, there's nothing I can do or say to change that. If there was, I'd be doing it.
The second hand ticked on, one quiet second after the next. Another sniff came through the line, reminding him of just how deeply hurt Marley had been. She'd loved the mother she once had, and the woman abandoned her. She'd loved her father too, and Charlie had passed away long before his time. Jason guessed her troubles had more to do with her own loss than they did with him being an actual flight risk. But how could he help Marley see the truth of it for herself? The fact was he couldn't. He really would have to let her go. At least for now. His body went weak, shoulders dropping, fists loosening, chest caving.
"Tell you what," he said softly. "If you're coming with me, I'll need to pick you up in 30 minutes. So decide, during that time, whether you're in or out. Once the 30 minutes is up, shoot me a text, let me know if you're going to come, okay?"
Jason.
"Don't decide right now. Please. Just take the half hour, will you?"
Jason would use the half hour himself, dropping to his knees and begging the Lord to pull this one final favor.
"Okay,"
she said in a whisper.
"I will."
Chapter 15. Marley sat against her headboard, arms folded as she stared at her luggage bag. 30 minutes. She didn't want to wait 30 minutes. The truth was, the damage was already done. It had taken more than half the night, but eventually Marley had finally seen reason. She'd had it right all along. She was simply too broken to be in a relationship with anyone. She'd spent hours in tears and torment, so many that she was practically numb to it now. Her diary to Dad rested beside her on the bed, still open to the letter she'd been writing last night. Her eyes shot to where she'd left off. Terrified that whatever it says could drown this new, able to love and be loved Marley, and the old me will be left in her place. She reached out and slammed the notebook closed. But that didn't stop her from reading the final words. A coward. Destined to be alone forever. Wow. Her own words were already coming back to haunt her. She glanced at the book once more, squinting when she noticed something peeking from the plastic pocket on front. A paper with Charlie's new logo had been tucked into the space. But it seemed there was something just behind it. Marley tugged at the corner of a manila pouch, freeing it from the pocket completely, and saw Dad's writing on the front. Not the fast, sloppy print he'd scribbled onto the labels and boxes. This was his best penmanship in cursive letters. "To my beautiful girls." A gasp tore from her throat. Was it possible he'd left something behind for them? Something they hadn't yet discovered? Oh, please, please, please. Marley flipped the pouch over and pinched the brass clip with a hurried hand. She opened the top fold and peeked inside to see 3 separate envelopes. She pulled them out and spread them over the bed. They were bulky, which meant they held more than simple paper. One for Marley, Brittany, and Lillian. It felt as if her heart might stop at the sight of her name on that envelope. Carefully, she tucked her sister's envelopes back into the pouch. Next, she lifted hers and pressed it against her heart while sobs of gratitude rocked through her body. How many times had she wished she could hear her father's voice just one more time? And this, in a way, was that very thing. Surprised she had any tears left, Marley wiped her face and sniffed, preparing herself to read the words he'd left behind. Her hands trembled as she pulled the folded page from the envelope. Something silver and shiny rested in the deep folds. But Marley would discover that after reading the letter. She pried it open and took in the wonderful sight of Dad's unique penmanship. What a treasure it was.
My Marley girl. Oh, how very badly I wish I could have fought a better fight. I wanted more than anything to be there for all those milestone marks. Lily's graduation, your weddings, the birth of my grandbabies. I'm not sure exactly how things run in the big place upstairs, but I promise I'll be there on special days like that, walking down the aisle along your side and bawling like the big baby I am.
Marley set the page on her lap, laughing and crying all at once. Oh, how she wanted to savor this. She slipped her hand into the envelope and retrieved a silver bracelet. She tipped her head to observe the charms linked onto the shiny chain. A soccer ball, a music note, and a tube of lipstick, which she assumed represented the chapstick she made. Next was a rainbow trout. Its body curved into an arch like the one on Charlie's logo. The final 2 charms were identical, matching crimson hearts. She fisted the bracelet and read on. I don't know what I would have done without you, Marley. I remember how excited you were to get your driver's license when you turned 16. Not because you were dying to drive to the mall and meet a bunch of boys. Well, maybe a little. But because you wanted to drive the girls to their soccer and choir practices. I made your bracelet as if you were the girls' mother yourself, since you take pride in their accomplishments, like any mother might. Thank you for that. Of course, you know the fish represent your old man, and the trout farm too, since it was such a great part of my life. I know you girls love that shop. But if you ever feel the need to let go of it and let some ornery old man take over, you have my blessing. Lastly, I want to talk about those 2 hearts. No plugging your ears during this part. I know you better than you think, and I have a feeling you're going to need to hear what I have to say. A rush of tingly heat poured over Marlee's skin. Yes, she did need to hear it. She was so lost right now, acting out in response to her mother's wicked words, possibly letting go of the best thing she'd ever had. 1 heart represents you. And if I'd have been able to make it match the love you give, kiddo, it'd be as big as our house. But the other heart is for the man you marry. Listen, I saw the way you closed off over the years, went on fewer and fewer dates, which is why I nicknamed you my little bull trout. But it occurred to me that you might be scared of letting someone in. So I want to share with you 2 things. 1, I loved Rachel, and I don't regret marrying her. How could I when it brought me the 3 greatest gifts of my life? 2, the only regret I do have is letting her hurt and fear keep me from marrying a second time. You remember Wanda? Used to come over a lot, bring us dinner. Stick around, read stories with you girls, or help out with your math since I was terrible at it. She couldn't birth children of her own, and boy, did she love you girls. She wanted to get married, but I kept putting her off. Eventually, she gave me an ultimatum. Agree to commit, or she'd accept a job offer in Wisconsin. I cried for months after she boarded that plane, but I never went and got her. I was too big of a coward. As you might have noticed, I stopped dating after that. That's my greatest regret, and I won't be around long enough to undo it. So here's where I turn things on you. I saw familiar fear in your eyes, a determination to keep your heart guarded with an army so strong that a guy wouldn't stand a chance. Don't do that. Find the right man and let him in. Let him bring you happiness and children and joy and love. It'll feel like a risk, but love always is. What your mother did really affected the past. Don't let it rob you of your future. I love you, forever and always, Marley. Dad. A knock sounded from the front door, pulling Marley from the daze she'd had on the letter. She shoved it to her chest once more, and lifted her chin toward the ceiling.
Thank you,
she breathed.
Thank you for saving me.
She hopped off her bed and raced to the door. Britt and Lily were running the fish farm, and since Jason was supposed to be picking her up soon, Marley could guess who it was. She flung it open with a flourish, ready to throw her arms around Jason and beg him to forgive her, but nobody was there. Her eyes dropped to the porch step. A package of fish bait. A quick glance at the narrow drive said she'd just missed the UPS man. She hurried back into her room to check the time. Oh no. It had been nearly an hour since she'd gotten off the phone with Jason. He'd be hopping on that flight any minute. And the only layover they had was in Paris, 10 hours away. Marley wiped her face with the back of her hands, shoved into her shoes, and shrugged her carry-on bag over her shoulder. She'd caused Jason a whole lot of hurt and grief. This wasn't something she could undo over the phone. Hopefully, she'd be able to make the flight on time. Just as she got to her doorway, the same place she'd removed her mother's necklace, Marley remembered something she'd left behind. Quickly, she snatched the bracelet off her bed and dashed out the house. Please say he'll forgive me. Chapter 16. Jason kept his eyes pasted on his phone, willing it to do something, anything. That wasn't exactly true. What he wanted it to do is glow or buzz or beep with something from Marley. Something that said she was sorry, and she wished very badly that she'd have just gone with him. Maybe it would go on to say that she'd be thinking of him every minute of all 26 days, and waiting to wrap her arms around him upon his return. Announcements blared from the overhead speakers in French and English alike. Flight and boarding information, still nothing about their flight, but soon. Soon, they'd ask the crew to line up and get ready to board. It was maddening to think back on his conversation with Marley. He'd spent the last 15 hours doing that very thing. 10 on a flight to Paris, 5 while stuck in the dreaded airport while the rest of his team toured a few nearby spots. As devastated as he was, and terrified that he might lose the woman he loved, Jason couldn't explain the occasional whispers of hope that came to his mind. She's going to come back, Jason, just wait. The only thing that allowed him to believe this was the phrase he'd heard so many times, that if someone truly belonged to him and he let them go, they'd come back. Jason felt very confident that he and Marley belonged to each other. He only prayed she'd realize that for herself over the next few weeks.
Son,
his dad said from across the way.
Time to board.
Jason snapped out of his daze in time to see his dad and Mary waving him toward the lineup. He came to his feet, stretched out his legs and arms, and heard someone hollering from deep within the crowded airport corridor. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. There was no possible way for Marley to be in this airport calling his name. But he turned to look over the crowd just the same. Again, it came. Someone was definitely shouting his name, and it sounded exactly like Marley's voice. He scanned over the bustling passengers, wheeling luggage as they broke off toward their gates. His heart stopped short when he saw her. A pair of denim jeans and a pale gray sweater. The colors blended well enough with the crowd, but he'd spot that beautiful face anywhere. Her blue eyes locked on him across the way, and suddenly, she bolted toward him, abandoning a shoulder bag on her arm and a carry-on at her feet. All blurred out of view as she wove past a woman with a stroller, an elderly couple squinting at the flight board, and what looked like an entire women's soccer team.
I'm so glad you didn't leave yet,
she breathed. He was too. But before he could say so, Marley pressed a kiss to his lips. Fellow passengers broke into whistles and cheers. A deep thrill poured into him, filling every empty, hurting space with warmth and hope.
I'm so sorry for panicking like I did. I love you.
She kissed him again and then again.
I love you so much.
Jason kissed her in return, echoing the sentiment between jagged breaths of his own. A sharp whistle sounded from the boarding area, gaining both Marley and Jason's attention at once. He looked over to see his father waving them toward the gate.
We've got Marley's bags.
Now come get on this flight before we have to take off without you. Good to see you, by the way," he said, nodding toward Marley.
Jason rested a hand at her lower back.
"Let's go to Morocco."
More waves of joy, peace, and hope poured over him as they took their seats on the flight. Marley was here. That was a start. As soon as they were seated, Marley lifted the armrest between them and snuggled into him. During the flight, she shared details of the notes to her dad. She told him about her mother's letter next, and the panic it caused. Lastly, Marley described the precious letter from her dad. She explained how his words had saved her this time, but said she didn't want to risk losing Jason again. That's when she told him about her plan to see a counselor when they got back. It was time she put her fear of abandonment behind her once and for all. Boy, was Jason glad to hear that. In fact, he could feel a barrier of his own whittling down at the idea of Marley shedding the fear that had haunted her for so long. Once she drifted off to sleep, Jason took some time to let it all sink in. It was hard to believe she was really there with him. Thank the heavens. He leaned down to kiss her head, relishing the warmth of having her close once more. He considered the trip they were on, the healing and hope they'd bring to so many, and realized he and Marley had been blessed with a large dose of those very things. Some might say Jason Keller had lived a charmed life. In a lot of ways, they'd be right. But he'd known times of hardship, too. And he could honestly say that there, with Marlee Jenkins by his side, he had enough hope to keep the plane afloat. And his future, now that she might very well be a part of it, had never looked brighter. Epilogue. Marley grinned as she watched Gunner tear down the hallway in a big wheel. Never had she seen a family welcome outdoor play toys in the halls of their very own home, but that's what made the Branson family so unique. Bob and Dee had gone so far as to knock out walls and remodel their home, all so it could accommodate large gatherings such as this, even in the winter months. While cradling a bundle of logs, Jason stepped over Mel and Pete, who'd gathered around the fireplace to string popcorn onto a Christmas garland for the tree.
"Got more wood,"
he announced as he lowered himself beside the mantel. Carols played in the background as Bob crooned out a few lines of his own.
"How's the hollandaise sauce coming along, dear?"
Dee asked, scurrying beside Marley with a pan of oven-fresh rolls. Marley whisked the yolks a bit more.
"Think we're ready for the melted butter?"
"Looks like it," Dee said before glancing toward the family room. She hollered to Jason's parents, inviting them and their spouses to help themselves at the snack bar.
"That goes for you too, Britt and Lily," she added.
Marley's sisters, who declared the Branson home their new favorite place, hovered over a ball of dough on the floured counter.
"Thanks," Lily said. "Should we make the next batch first?"
"No, you two go ahead. Rachel and Peyton can take over the next dozen. I think you're in more demand over there by the ranch hands." Marley glanced over to see Taylor, Lincoln, and Brody by the chips and dip. Britt and Lily wasted no time heading to that end of the snack table as well. Joy swelled thick in her heart as she recalled the months that had passed since she first came to the Bransons' place for their anniversary party. Marley might have freaked out for a bit when she'd read her mother's threat, but fear hadn't won. In fact, with her angel father's help, she defeated that fear in the very same day. Of course, it took longer than that to rebuild trust with Jason. She'd likely frightened him by panicking the way she did, but they'd come a very long way since then, especially with the help of the very wise counselor she'd been seeing. Now, when Marley mused on a future with Jason, she was no longer riddled with voices of doubts and fear. Hope had filled the void completely, and Marley couldn't remember being so happy.
"Can I have everyone's attention?"
Jason hollered from the front room. He dusted off his hands and motioned towards Marley, giving that playful smile as soon as their eyes met.
Mind coming on in here for a minute, babe?
Was it just her, or had the music died down along with the chatter? Excited whispers rose from Britt and Lily's corner of the room. Marley rested the whisk and dusted her hands on her apron. "Here, hun," Dee said. "Let me get that for you." She untied the apron and shimmied it up and over Marley's head, then gave her a playful spank on the butt. "Go ahead now, dear." Marley let out a laugh. "Thanks." She pasted her eyes on the travertine floor as she wove through the loved ones gathered there, and soon she was standing beside Jason, the yummy scent of his aftershave toying with her senses already.
"I've been thinking about the best way to ask you this," he said in that low, raspy voice. "And when I started questioning our family and friends about it, they all said they wanted to help."
Marley furrowed her brows. "Help?" Jason grinned and waved a hand to the group. Marley spun around to see a new addition. A large banner stretched across the room. Flag-shaped cards held bright red letters, each spelling out one very important question. "Will you marry me?" A deep thrill shot straight into her heart, hot and cold all at once. She spun back around to face Jason. Jason lowered himself onto one knee and looked up at her through his dark lashes.
"Marlee Jenkins. From the first time I picked up a pole and hit the pond at Charlie's trout farm, you caught my attention. You didn't exactly make it easy for me, but eventually you gave me a chance. And since then, you've captured nearly every thought that passes through my mind. More than that, you've captured my heart."
He tugged a small box from his pocket and held it in his fist.
"I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Marley. I want to spend year after year making amazing memories together."
He cracked open the box to reveal a glistening diamond ring.
"Will you be my wife?"
Marley could see him through the tears. It went pin-drop quiet as she stared at the ring, the sight of it a promise all its own. She moved her gaze back to those gorgeous brown eyes of his. "Yes!" Marley cheered. "Of course I'll marry you!" Hoots, hollers, whistles, and cheers rang throughout the home. Mel and Pete broke into some sort of victory dance while making rap noises. Jason shot to his feet.
"She said yes!"
He plucked the ring from the box with shaky hands and slid it onto her finger, then came in for a celebratory kiss.
"I love you,"
he mumbled between kisses. "I love you too," she assured.
"Lucky thing she said yes," Taylor said. "Would have really ruined dinner if she said no."
Luke tossed a pillow at him. "Let's see the ring!" Britt and Lily hollered in unison. Jason wrapped his arm around Marley as she held out her hand for all to see. The beautiful diamond ring earned a round of oohs and ahs. Other comments filtered over the room. "It's perfect, gorgeous, so happy for them." In a moment of quiet pause, time seeming to slow for a blink, Marley's bracelet caught a splash of light from the Christmas tree, causing one of the charms to glow. Charlie's trout. Her heart leapt at the sight. He'd promised to be there for special days, hadn't he? Yes. The waves of warmth rippling through her said that he was, in fact, celebrating with them too. Tonight, she'd taken an important step toward fulfilling the wish Charlie had for her. Her eyes drifted down to the two crimson hearts. Jason might have joked about her capturing his heart, but in Marley's case, the statement rang true. He'd hooked her from their very first date, and now, together, life was sure to be one heck of a ride. The end. This has been The Cowboy's Catch, a fun, faith-based cowboy romance. Written by Kimberly Krey, narrated by Morgana Morningside. Copyright 2021 by Kimberly Krey. Production copyright by Kimberly Krey.